Before Pope Gregory the Ninth came for the whiskers, Europe was already giving strong "we're barely hanging on" energy. The 13th century wasn't exactly the golden age of rational thinking. In fact, it was more of a dimly lit age, where bathing was suspicious, bread was about 40% gravel, and medical advice ranged from "drink mercury" to "have you tried leeches?" Hello, travelers. Histories do not always need to be boring. You can rest here and listen to hilarious histories to drift off to sleep. Tonight we will explore the topic why Pope Gregory the Ninth's war on cats backfired, and many more. Now leave a comment to let me know when and where you are listening to this, and hit the subscribe button, but only if you enjoy what I do here. Let's begin. Let's start with the basics. Hygiene, or rather the complete absence of it. People didn't just forget to wash, they actively avoided it. Water was seen as a disease vector, and a bath was something you took once a year, preferably while being knighted. The medieval mindset genuinely believed that dirt protected you from illness. And in their defense, soap was a luxury item, kind of like a Tesla but for peasants. If you had it, you were showing off. Now toss in a few more spices to this medieval stew of misery. Superstition ruled everything. If your cow stopped producing milk, it wasn't because it was sick. It was because a local widow hexed it by glaring too hard. Bad harvest? Must be the result of someone not crossing themselves hard enough. Stub toe? A demon. Entire worldview. Basically, the world is scary. Let's blame the nearest suspicious thing. Enter cats. Furry, quiet, nocturnal, and very much misunderstood. But more on them later. Despite all this medieval madness, there was a fragile ecological balance teetering on the whiskers of feline kind. See, cats weren't just cozy companions lounging around in monasteries, though they absolutely did that too. They were working animals, and their job description was simple: kill rats, or mice, or anything that squeaked and carried bubonic plague in its pocket. Cats were like the unpaid interns of medieval pest control. You wouldn't put them on a stained glass window, but if you had grain stored in your house, you wanted a cat or two prowling around. Rodents were the ultimate freeloaders. They ate your food, slept in your walls, and left behind diseases that could take out your entire village before the rooster crowed twice. Urban centers were especially rat-prone, partly because cities were exploding in population, and partly because people were tossing their trash into the streets like raccoons with zero impulse control. Picture open gutters, meat markets with questionable sanitation, and latrines that were just holes in the ground covered with regret. Now imagine that scenario without cats. The food situation, grim. Medieval bread had more in common with gravel than gluten, and if your stew didn't crunch, you were suspicious. Meat was salted until it resembled jerky made from bricks, and fresh produce was a luxury reserved for the 3 days a year it wasn't buried under snow or locusts. Food didn't nourish you, it tested you. Breakfast wasn't something you looked forward to, it just sort of happened to you. And don't forget, medieval Europe didn't have a solid grasp of germ theory. They didn't even have a shaky grasp. Diseases weren't caused by microorganisms. They were caused by bad air, curses, and sometimes the sin of your cousin's neighbor. If someone sneezed, they weren't offered a tissue. They were offered last rites. So amid this charming rat-infested superstition-heavy circus, cats were quietly pulling more than their fair share of the weight. They weren't seen as saints, but they also hadn't yet been branded sinners. They existed in a sort of neutral limbo, tolerated, sometimes appreciated, rarely celebrated, and it worked. As long as cats did their job, the rats stayed somewhat in check, and the diseases they carried didn't explode into full-blown pandemics. It was a precarious balance, one that no one realized was vital until someone decided to light the fuse. So here we are, a pre-plague Europe with filthy streets, fragile health, mystical paranoia, and an unspoken alliance with the humble house cat. Everything was almost functioning. In the same way that a wagon with 3 wheels still rolls downhill. Cats weren't heroes, they weren't villains. They were just there, keeping the worst of the worst at bay with nothing but claws and contempt. The good news? You're alive. The bad news? The fleas are also there. But things were about to change. All it took was one papal decree, a little fear of the devil, and a whole lot of very confused meowing to send this delicate balance into freefall. Europe didn't know it yet, but they were about to literally unleash the rats. And spoiler alert, the rats were thrilled. If you're looking for the origin story of history's weirdest holy war, one that involves fur, claws, and a whole lot of unintended consequences, you'll need to get acquainted with the man who started it all, Pope Gregory the Ninth. Now, before you imagine a kindly old man doling out blessings and pasta recipes, let's clear the incense. This guy wasn't your cozy neighborhood pope. Gregory the Ninth was the religious equivalent of a flamethrower in a library, devout, dramatic, and absolutely not afraid to stir things up. Born Ugolini di Conti around 1145 into the powerful Conti family of Anagni, Italy's medieval version of born into Wi-Fi and influence, Gregory had all the makings of a heavyweight, educated in theology and law at the University of Paris. Yes, that Paris. Back when it was less cross-on, more scholastic squabbling. He was smart, sharp, and deeply religious in a time when religious often doubled as terrified of everything. He started out his career under the wing of Pope Innocent III, who basically ran Europe like a divine CEO. Ugolino rose quickly through the church ranks, known for his fiery sermons, love of canon law, and a glare that could curdle milk, when he eventually donned the papal mitre in 1227, becoming Pope Gregory IX. He didn't so much ease into power as he did catapult into it like a medieval hype train fueled by righteousness and sheer papal willpower. Gregory IX saw himself as a defender of the church, a smiter of heresy, and a holy crusader against corruption. The church, to him, wasn't just an institution. It was the front line in a cosmic battle between heaven and everything that smelled even slightly demonic. His papacy was less about gentle guidance and more about locking horns with emperors, launching inquisitions, and basically treating any theological disagreement like it was an emergency fire drill from hell. He was particularly obsessed with heresy. Any deviation from church doctrine was a personal offense, like someone had insulted his dog and his favorite psalm at the same time. Under his rule, the papal inquisition was formalized. Yes, that inquisition, tasked with rooting out religious dissent like it was a full-time medieval game of Guess Who, but with more burning. Now let's talk about Gregory's flair for drama. He wasn't subtle. He didn't do half measures. He loved writing long, scorching letters called papal bulls, full of righteous fury and heavenly mandates. These documents were the medieval version of an angry email sent at 3 a.m., except instead of CCing your boss, Gregory was CCing every bishop in Europe and possibly the Almighty, which brings us to the infamous Vox in Rama, issued in 1233. This wasn't just any decree. It was basically the ecclesiastical equivalent of declaring open season on cats. In it, Gregory alleged that heretics, particularly those suspected of practicing satanic rituals, were worshipping a demonic figure that often took the shape of a black cat. To Gregory, this wasn't just weird, it was proof of an unholy conspiracy, a fluffy, purring conspiracy. How he came to this conclusion? Likely a mix of bad intel, feverish fear of paganism, and a few too many wild accusations from informants who were probably less holy whistleblowers and more guys with too much time and not enough cats. Some historians believe he was reacting to reports from Germany involving groups accused of devil worship, and those stories included cats. Cue the papal alarm bells. But here's the kicker. Gregory wasn't anti-animal in general. He once gave sermons about the majesty of creation. He wasn't calling for the extinction of cows or cancelling goats. But cats? Cats crossed a line. In his mind, they weren't just aloof. They were agents of evil. Silent, mysterious, observant, probably judging him. It didn't help that black cats were already wrapped up in centuries of pagan folklore and associated with things that went bump in the night. To Gregory, cats weren't adorable pest controllers or loyal lap warmers. They were potential vessels of Satan, walking hairballs of heresy. And as Pope, he had both the power and the platform to do something about it. Spoiler, he did. Funny line, he had a hotline to heaven and a vendetta against tabbies. Still, we shouldn't mistake Gregory for a total lunatic. By the standards of the time, he was actually considered reasonable, just extremely zealous. This was an era when fear of the supernatural wasn't fringe, it was mainstream. When plagues, famines, and lightning strikes were explained not with science, but with demons and divine wrath. And in that context, believing a furry creature with glowing eyes might be part of Satan's HR department didn't sound as far-fetched as it does today. In the end, Pope Gregory IX left behind a complex legacy. He strengthened the papacy, codified canon law, and made it very, very clear that he did not trust anything that purred in the dark. His reign was fire and brimstone wrapped in a velvet robe, and his war on cats. Well, that was just the beginning of a very messy chapter in Europe's history. One that, spoiler alert, would end with a lot of rats saying mercy. Let's talk about one of history's strangest plot twists. How black cats went from being humble mouse assassins to Satan's alleged sidekicks. And the spark that ignited this surreal turn of events? A papal document known as the Vox in Rama, the medieval equivalent of a press release from heaven, except instead of announcing peace and goodwill, it declared war on cats. Vox in Rama, issued in 1233 by Pope Gregory IX, was no light-hearted memo. This wasn't "please remember to water the basilica plants" or "Friday's fish again." No, this was a fiery denunciation of heresy and evil, packed with all the medieval horror you could imagine. Secret cults, baby-eating ceremonies, seriously, and a suspicious amount of feline involvement. According to this papal bull, reports had reached the Vatican about a satanic cult operating in Germany. The letter described in gory detail how new cult members were allegedly initiated into devil worship through rituals involving a black cat. And not just any cat, one that was supposedly kissed on the buttocks as part of the ceremony. Yes, you read that right. In this alternate universe of heresy fan fiction, Satan's introductory handshake was a feline rear-end smooch. According to this decree, Satan didn't want your soul, he wanted your house cat. Let's take a moment to appreciate the absurdity of that. But back to the text. The Vox in Rama painted a vivid picture. Followers of this heretical sect were said to summon a toad as large as a dog, a pale man so thin he was almost transparent, and then cue dramatic thunder, a black cat, which would reportedly walk backward before speaking in a human voice. That's not a religious movement, that's the opening act of a haunted circus. Still, medieval minds didn't laugh, they panicked. Because in the 13th century, you didn't need a lot of evidence to start a moral panic. All you needed was a few spooky stories, a suspicious animal, and someone in authority yelling, "It's the devil!" And cats, especially black cats, fit the bill all too well. Why black cats? It wasn't just the color. Darkness had long been associated with danger, evil, and all things unholy. Throw in the fact that black cats were nocturnal, had glowing eyes that reflected torchlight like tiny infernos, and could silently appear or disappear at will, and you've got yourself a perfect scapegoat, or more accurately, a scapecat. It didn't help that cats were often seen as independent, unbothered, and completely unimpressed by humans, a trait that to medieval folk looked suspiciously like arrogance. In a world where dogs were loyal and livestock were obedient, cats were the wild cards. And when something can't be controlled, humans historically tend to either put it on a pedestal or on trial. In pre-Christian traditions, cats had enjoyed a much better reputation. In ancient Egypt, they were revered. Killing one was punishable by death. But once Christianity began spreading through Europe, many pagan symbols and animals associated with older religions were recast as evil. Cats, who had played important roles in pagan households and fertility cults, were suddenly suspect. By the time Gregory's Vox in Rama hit the streets, the feline reputation was already on thin ice. But this wasn't just about cats being weird and slinky. This was about control. In an era where the church's authority was supreme, anything that even whiffed of heresy, was a threat to both spiritual order and political power. If people were gathering in secret and whispering strange things about cats and toads, it meant they weren't just spiritually lost, they were outside the church's influence, and that made them dangerous. So cats got caught in the theological crossfire. They weren't agents of evil, but they were guilt by association with those accused of being so. They appeared in the wrong place at the wrong time, anywhere heretics were rumored to live, and became walking evidence of a cosmic crime. Of course, the real tragedy wasn't just the loss of a few cats. The vox in Rama set off a chain reaction that led to widespread feline extermination across parts of Europe. Inquisitors took it seriously. Ordinary people took it seriously. Towns and villages began rounding up cats, especially black ones, and killing them, burning, drowning, and more. All because of a papal bull that read like a horror novel written by someone with a vendetta against their neighbor's pet. And while this chapter doesn't dive into what happened next, don't worry, that's coming. We can already feel the tremors of unintended consequences, because as the meows faded, the rats were warming up backstage, ready for their curtain call. But for now, let's stay in the weird theatrical world of medieval superstition, where a cat's biggest crime wasn't scratching your furniture, it was allegedly moonlighting for the devil. If cats really were Satan's agents, they must have been the laziest minions in history, unless you count napping for 18 hours a day as a form of spiritual warfare. If there's one thing history teaches us, it's that medieval Europe never met a panic it couldn't escalate. After Pope Gregory IX issued the vox in Rama, branding black cats as the furry foot soldiers of Satan, things didn't just go off the rails, they launched themselves into the heresy stratosphere. 1 minute, cats were catching mice, minding their own business. The next, they were being rounded up like they'd just leaked state secrets. What followed was not just a few scattered incidents of animal cruelty. It was a continent-wide catastrophe for cats. Villages, towns, and cities across Europe took Gregory's decree as a divine green light to start clearing out the whiskered evil. And once the ball of fur started rolling, it didn't stop. Burnings, drownings, beatings, hangings. Europe went full cat hunting frenzy. Entire towns organized public cat executions, often held during festivals or religious events, as if torching the local tabby was just another form of wholesome community fun. Think of it as a very medieval block party, but with significantly fewer snacks and significantly more screaming. Funny line. Cats were accused of witchcraft, devil worship, and probably bad table manners. Let's be clear, this wasn't just about black cats. Sure, they got the worst of it. Dark fur plus dark times double trouble. But the paranoia was contagious. If your cat had a slightly crooked tail, suspicious. If it stared at the wall for too long, definitely communing with Beelzebub. If it coughed up a hairball in front of the church, better light the pyre. The fear spread like wildfire, largely because fear was the only thing that moved faster than the mail in medieval Europe. And with every whispered rumor of heretical cults, strange rituals, or unexplained misfortunes, the list of cat-related crimes grew more absurd. Scratching furniture, probably a coded message from Lucifer. Purring, clearly a demonic chant in disguise. Sneezing, well, that's just black magic with extra flair. And here's the worst part. This wasn't just fueled by religious orders or inquisitors. Regular people joined in. Peasants, merchants, even nobles took part in the purges. After all, who wouldn't want to rid their home of the supposed embodiment of evil? Cats, once the silent partners in medieval pest control, were now cast as villains in a cosmic horror story they never asked to be part of. Of course, medieval folks weren't exactly famous for nuanced critical thinking. This is a world where sneezing without saying God bless you might land you under suspicion, where crop failure could be blamed on your neighbor's weird cough, and where coincidence wasn't a category, everything was a sign. So when someone heard the church had declared cats demonic, they didn't ask, wait, who decided that? They asked, where's the nearest bucket of water? Cats were also uniquely vulnerable because of their behavior. Unlike dogs, who tend to obey humans, or at least pretend to, cats do what they want when they want. and they do it while staring at you with judgmental indifference. That kind of independence doesn't play well in an age where obedience was the holy grail of morality. A creature that didn't come when called, clearly up to no good, and the superstition cocktail just kept getting stronger. Cats became increasingly tied to witchcraft, especially as the late medieval period inched toward full-on witch-hunting hysteria. Women who lived alone, owned cats, or, heaven forbid, talked to them were often accused of being witches. It didn't help that cats are naturally curious, tend to follow their humans around, and stare blankly at corners like they're tracking invisible phantoms, which, to be fair, is unsettling. So what do you do when you've branded an entire species as demonic? You start removing them from the narrative. Cats were driven out of homes, monasteries and cities. In many places they simply vanished, not by evolution, but by torch and pitchfork. And the towns that once teemed with feline life began to stink a little more, scratch a little more, and squeak a whole lot more. But we're not there yet. This chapter isn't about rats. They're warming up in the next act. It's about the fur-fueled paranoia that swept Europe like a plague of its own. There's something uniquely tragic about it. Cats, creatures that never asked to be sacred or profane, found themselves squarely in humanity's line of fire, because people wanted an enemy they could see, touch, and burn at the stake, and cats, unfortunately, couldn't write strongly worded rebuttals. And the irony, in trying to purge the devil, Europe ended up exercising one of its best lines of defense against something far worse. But that's a spoiler for later. For now, all you need to know is this. Europe declared meow no more, and cats were forced into hiding, burned in bonfires, and erased from history books, as if medieval pest control had suddenly solved itself. They hadn't. In fact, they'd just opened the door for a different kind of horror. If cats were guilty of anything, it was knocking over one too many goblets, but apparently that's all it took to get branded as Satan's barista. By the time the last torch was snuffed out, and the smell of burnt fur faded from medieval air, Europe had made one thing clear. Cats were out. Unfortunately, no one sent the same memo to the rats, and they moved in like they'd just won the lottery. With their feline predators exterminated, the rodents of Europe emerged from walls, sewers, and haystacks like tiny disease-ridden revolutionaries. They didn't waste time. One day, a town square might have hosted a cat-burning ceremony. The next, it was hosting a rat family reunion with open buffet access. Without cats enforcing the natural order, rats had full VIP access to food stores, homes, monasteries, and anywhere people were dumb enough to leave a crumb behind. Imagine inviting termites over after firing your exterminator. Welcome to 13th century logic. You might wonder just how bad could it get. Well, let's put it this way. If cats were previously keeping the rodent population at a cautious simmer, the post-cat world cranked the heat up to boiling. Rats are prolific breeders. A female rat can birth a litter every few weeks. Each litter has about 6 to 12 babies. Within months, one pair of rats can turn into hundreds. Within a year, it's a rodent megachurch. And remember, medieval towns weren't exactly sanitary fortresses. Streets doubled as sewers. Food storage involved putting grain in a bag and hoping for the best. Trash? Just throw it out the window. Meat? Hang it in the open air and pray the wind is cold. In other words, rats had found their rodent paradise, and there wasn't a single fluffy enforcer left to challenge their reign. With their enemies gone, rats did what rats do best. They ate, nested, gnawed, and spread filth faster than a Facebook conspiracy theory. They chewed through wood, cloth, rope, and anything standing between them and a good snack. They infested bakeries, barns, cellars, and churches. At night, they scurried through the rafters. During the day, they bold-faced strutted across kitchen floors like they paid rent. But rats weren't just annoying. They were also living public health disasters in tiny grey suits. Every rat was a potential mobile disease unit. They carried fleas. The fleas carried Yersinia pestis, a microscopic party crasher that would soon become the most infamous biological villain in human history. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. In this chapter we focus on the rats themselves. the way they quietly crept into the power vacuum left behind by the feline genocide. And what's terrifying is just how well they adapted. In an age before pest control, sanitation departments or functioning plumbing, rats were the undisputed kings of the underworld, ruling the gaps between floorboards and the shadows beneath granaries. And the people? For a while they didn't notice, or they pretended not to. After all, they had just enthusiastically wiped out the only animal equipped to manage the infestation. Admitting there was a rat problem would have been like throwing a party, setting the house on fire and then wondering why everyone left. This was especially devastating for urban centres. Cities like London, Paris and Florence, with their dense populations and tight quarters, were now crawling with rats. Without cats patrolling rooftops and alleyways, the rodent population wasn't just growing, it was exploding. And unlike cats, rats weren't selective about their behaviour. They chewed holes in food sacks, nibbled at people in their sleep, and nested in churches, barns and royal halls alike. If your village held a feast, the rats would attend. If your monastery stored wine, the rats would drink first. They were shameless, fearless and shockingly resilient. Meanwhile, some people tried to replace cats with terriers or traps, but these solutions were like handing out umbrellas in a hurricane. A few brave souls even tried to domesticate ferrets and weasels for the job. Great in theory, less great when your new rat patrol starts biting the clergy. And let's not forget, most people still didn't understand how disease worked. So while rats were staging their hostile takeover of Europe's grain supply, most folks just thought it was God's will or a punishment for sin. The idea that they'd made a massive rodent-shaped mistake? Nowhere in the medieval mind, not yet anyway, to the rats. This was a golden age. They didn't know or care about papal decrees or moral panics. All they knew was that their biggest threat had been extinguished, and the humans were too busy arguing about theology to notice the scratching in their walls. The cats were gone. The empire of whiskers had fallen. Long live the tale. And so Europe became a cheese-scented dystopia, where rats nibbled freely and no one was left to chase them off the table. The fields were crawling, the streets were swarming, and no one, not even the Pope, seemed to realize what was coming. Yet, if the rat takeover of Europe was acting one in the continent's worst pest-based drama, then Act 2 came crashing through the door wearing a black cloak and coughing up blood. It was none other than the Black Death, a pandemic so brutal, so all-consuming, it made the apocalypse feel like an overdue tax bill. And no, the plague didn't stroll in politely. It hitched a ride on fleas who were themselves joyriding on rats, who, as we've established, were now thriving in every home, church, bakery and public latrine across Europe, thanks to the whole "let's burn all the cats" movement. It was the most unholy carpool in history. The plague arrived fashionably late, but it made an entrance no one forgot, and brought +1s, boils, fever and existential dread. The year was 1347 and things were about to get very oozing. The bubonic plague, caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis, entered through trading ships docking in Sicily. These ships weren't just carrying spices and silk, they were carrying rats, and on those rats, fleas, and in those fleas, bacteria that would soon make Europe look like a bad horror story written in pus and despair. Within months, the disease swept through ports and cities with a kind of grotesque efficiency. It didn't creep, it sprinted. It made the rounds faster than gossip in a monastery. Merchants, pilgrims and invaders all helped it move along, like unwitting Uber drivers of doom. And what were the symptoms? Oh, nothing dramatic. Just black boils the size of eggs, bleeding under the skin, hallucinations and a tendency to die within a week. That's if you were lucky. Some died in hours. Others lingered in agony, rotting while still breathing. If that sounds grim, congratulations. You're beginning to grasp what it was like to live in a time when medicine involved prayers, herbs, and possibly drilling holes in your head to let the evil out. Doctors, such as they were, showed up in terrifying bird-beaked plague masks, filled with herbs to filter the air. People genuinely believed in miasma theory, the idea that disease came from bad air rather than, being covered in flea bites from a rat the size of a small dog. Many physicians ran for the hills anyway. It turns out your medical oath to help humanity has a fine print escape clause when the patient might explode into pustules. But let's pause here and appreciate the real cosmic irony. For centuries, Europe had cats working a silent, unpaid shift, keeping rats and by extension fleas at bay. They weren't worshipped or thanked. At best, they were tolerated. At worst, they were burned alive in town squares by people waving crucifixes and shouting about Satan. And once those same people were too busy coughing up blood to light any more torches, the universe gently whispered, "See, the plague spread from Italy to France, then Spain, then the Holy Roman Empire, and eventually to England and Scandinavia. It rode horses, boats, carts, and boots. No region was safe. Entire villages vanished. Bodies were piled in pits because there weren't enough gravediggers. Churches overflowed with prayers and corpses. Cities like Florence and London lost over half their populations, half. That's not a disaster. That's an extinction rehearsal. Of course, people desperately tried to find meaning in the chaos. Some blamed Jewish communities, leading to horrific pogroms. Others blamed foreigners, lepers, sin, or astrology. There were even bands of flagellants, roving gangs of people who beat themselves with whips in public, hoping to earn divine forgiveness through pain. Spoiler, it didn't help. Not once did anyone say, maybe getting rid of all the cats was a tactical blunder, because again, no one knew about germs. The connection between fleas, rats and plague was a mystery locked inside a bacterial hitchhiker they couldn't see, name or fight. The real cause of the Black Death wouldn't be understood until centuries later, long after Europe had buried millions and rewritten its social, political and spiritual landscape in grave dirt. And yet throughout all this, the rats carried on, gnawing, breeding, thriving. The fleas kept biting, and the humans, they wept, burned incense and dug graves. The cat massacre had not only failed to protect them, it had created the perfect ecosystem for a biological wildfire. You can't really blame the rats though, they were just being rats. It was the humans who turned on their best line of defense, and then stood back in shocked silence as the house burned down and the neighbors coughed themselves into oblivion. In total, it's estimated that the Black Death killed between 75 to 200 million people. That's not just a bad year, that's the worst biological disaster in recorded history. And somewhere in the wreckage, a lone flea probably looked up and said, all this because someone thought a purring cat was Satan. When you fire the cats and promote the rats, don't be surprised when your entire continent turns into a biohazard with candles. If you thought the plague was brutal, wait until you meet its sidekick, medieval logic, because while Yersinia pestis was busy turning Europe into one giant funeral procession, people weren't turning to facts. No, that would have been far too reasonable. They turned instead to superstition, celestial finger-pointing, and a blindfolded game of guess the wrathful deity. Science in the 1300s was basically shrug and pray harder. Let's be clear, science did exist, but it was mostly trapped in monasteries, written in Latin, and buried under 800 years of Aristotle misquotes. The average person had about as much access to accurate medical knowledge as they did to personal hygiene, and even among the experts, the go-to response to sudden continent-wide death was usually, "It's the stars, it's your sins," or "Have you tried more leeches?" One popular theory was miasma, or bad air, not to be confused with actual pollution. This was more like invisible evil fog. People believed that foul smells like those from rotting garbage, swamps, or your uncle's feet could carry disease directly into your lungs. The logical solution: carry flowers in your pockets, stuff herbs into beaked masks, and never open a window again. If you've ever wondered why plague doctors looked like bird people on their way to a Victorian masquerade, now you know. Another popular culprit: comets. That's right, those glittery space rocks trailing across the sky, obviously a sign that God was furious. A particularly bright one had been seen in 1345, and by 1347, the streets were piled high with bodies. Coincidence? The medieval answer was a resounding no, definitely not. That comet was the angel of death's party invite. People also blamed planetary alignment. In 1348, the medical faculty at the University of Paris which was apparently the Ivy League of Please Guess What's Killing Us, issued a report blaming the plague on Saturn, Mars, and Jupiter, lining up the wrong way, like three cosmic interns knocking over a vial of celestial poison. And then there were the saints. People believed that the Black Death was divine punishment for all sorts of sins, greed, vanity, eating meat on Wednesdays, or just being alive and slightly unholy. The solution? More prayer, more fasting, more self-flagellation. Entire groups of flagellants wandered town to town, whipping themselves in public squares, hoping their pain would atone for everyone's collective misbehavior. If this all sounds incredibly chaotic, that's because it was. And into that chaos poured even more chaos. Rumors, scapegoats, and a total collapse of reason. For example, instead of noticing the sudden explosion of rats chewing through their floorboards, many communities began blaming Jewish populations, accusing them of poisoning wells. This led to horrific massacres, pogroms that wiped out entire Jewish communities, based entirely on fabricated confessions extracted through torture. It was a tragic and brutal example of how fear, ignorance, and bigotry can combine into one particularly deadly cocktail. Meanwhile, the rats were thriving. Every time someone lit incense to cleanse the air, a rat snuck into their pantry. Every time someone blamed a comet, a flea laid eggs in their bedding. Facts didn't just take a back seat, they were thrown out of the cart altogether. To make matters worse, the people who did try to find scientific explanations were often ignored, mocked, or even punished. Early efforts at quarantine, especially in Italian city-states, showed a rudimentary understanding of contagion. But try explaining germ theory in a time when no one had microscopes and most books were chained to cathedral walls. You might as well have suggested that rats were secretly agents of fate sent to test Europe's cheese reserves. Even basic public health measures were torpedoed by superstition. Bathhouses were shut down because people believed bathing opened your pores to disease. That's right. When your streets are filled with corpses and rats are throwing rooftop raves, the last thing you want is a clean, hydrated population. Doctors advised people to avoid anything joyful. No singing, no laughter, no dancing. Apparently happiness made you more vulnerable to the plague, which, let's be honest, explains a lot about how grim everyone looked in those oil paintings. And yet, through all this, the most obvious solution, the one with whiskers and a track record, was nowhere to be found. Cats were still persona non grata, too demonic to pet, too cursed to keep around. The one creature that might have restored a smidge of balance was still on the church's do not resuscitate list. By the late 1300s, the death toll was staggering. Entire villages vanished. Priests stopped showing up to mass. Farmers left their fields. Families buried loved ones and then disappeared themselves. And the worst part? No one had a clue what to do next, because how could they? This was a world ruled by the stars, by saints, by smells and portents and dreams, a world where facts were strangers and fear was king. And in that world, science didn't stand a chance. In a time when rats ruled the streets and doctors wore bird masks, the smartest guy in the village was probably the one who just stayed inside and talked to a broom. As Europe continued coughing, bleeding, and flagellating its way through the 14th century, a strange and uncomfortable thought began to creep into the corridors of church leadership. What if we made a mistake? At first the notion was quietly horrifying. After all, the church doesn't exactly specialize in oopsies. When you've spent decades branding cats as demonic agents of Satan and encouraging their public execution, it's a little awkward to turn around and say, actually, we might have overreacted. Please stop burning Garfield. But as bodies piled up, cities emptied, and rats turned wine cellars into frat houses, even the most devout clerics began to piece things together. Cats, it turned out, were not miniature antichrists sent to spy on your soul. They were exterminators with tails, silent, efficient, and tragically flammable exterminators. Turns out the devil's little helpers were also your best pest control agents. The problem for the church was that reversing course wasn't easy. Papal decrees weren't casual tweets you could just delete. The Vox in Rama had been official church policy, and publicly admitting it may have accidentally greenlit one of the worst public health disasters in human history. That was a PR nightmare with incense. But denial only worked for so long. Monasteries were emptying. Priests were dropping like flies. Holy water was doing precisely zero against flea-borne pathogens. People who had obediently followed the church's lead and purged their homes of feline sin were now watching rats chew through their doors, and they were starting to ask questions. So what did the church do? Well, first it doubled down, because that's usually how institutions react to disaster. Some leaders continued to preach about sin and divine punishment. Others insisted that cats were still suspect, and that any suggestion to the contrary was heresy. But as time dragged on and the plague refused to politely go away, subtle cracks began to form. Clerics started quietly reintroducing cats into monasteries. Not with trumpets and apologies, of course. More like, "This is Brother Fluffington. He lives here now. Don't ask." The official line may have stayed anti-cat, but behind the altar, a few bishops were already laying out saucers of milk. In fact, in some communities, local leaders began to encourage cat ownership, covertly of course. Cities that managed to preserve small cat populations noticed, quite logically, that they were a bit less overrun with rats. These areas fared marginally better during the plague, and word started to spread. Hey, maybe Satan's whiskered interns are actually kind of helpful? Still, it was a slow and awkward shift. Public theology doesn't pivot easily, especially when that theology involves denouncing animals as furry demons. And even as some church leaders came around to the idea that cats might be less than 100% evil, the idea of publicly reversing a papal bull was nearly unthinkable. Papal infallibility doesn't mesh well with sorry for the mass extermination of your pets. That said, not every member of the clergy had bought into the anti-cat hysteria to begin with. Some monasteries, especially those far from the political centers, had always quietly kept cats around, especially to protect valuable manuscripts and food stores from gnawing rodents. These cats were unofficial monks in their own right, silent celibate, hopefully, and shockingly good at keeping pestilence at bay. Eventually, the sheer pressure of plague survival began to outweigh the superstition. By the late 1300s, common sense began staging a comeback, and even the more superstitious church voices couldn't ignore the evidence. Everywhere cats were reintroduced, rat populations dipped, grain stores lasted longer, fewer people woke up with flea bites. Was it divine intervention? A miracle of St. Francis? Or just, cats doing their job? Still, no great mea culpa ever came from the Vatican. There was no papal scroll titled "Oops, a history of bad feline policy." The church moved on in classic medieval fashion, with silence, gradual backpedaling and pretending the past didn't exist. But history remembers, and perhaps more interestingly, the cat's reputation began to recover, slowly but surely. They went from feared to tolerated to eventually welcome again in homes and villages. Not because the church admitted it had erred, but because survival has a funny way of clarifying priorities. Sure, cats were mysterious. Yes, they stared at walls like they could see ghosts. And no, they weren't exactly known for following orders. But they also didn't chew through your grain, bite your ankles, or carry fleas that made you bleed from the eyes. At a certain point, practicality trumped theology. So while the official record remained quiet, the silent policy shift was unmistakable. Bring back the cats, let them do their thing, and maybe, just maybe, stop setting them on fire. When your best plague-fighting strategy turns out to have 4 legs and a sardonic purr, maybe it's time to admit that sainthood and sandpaper tongues aren't mutually exclusive. It turns out cats are excellent at revenge. Not the kind that involves claws and shredded curtains, but the kind where they outlive their enemies, reclaim their thrones, and nap triumphantly on the ashes of history. Because by the end of the Black Death's reign, and well into the late medieval period, the feline reputation began its slow, glorious comeback. Europe had finally started to realize the truth. Cats weren't evil, they were just emotionally unavailable pest control experts. Cats went from being burned at the stake to curled up by the fireplace like nothing happened. classic cat behavior. This redemption arc didn't happen overnight. There was no parade, no public apology, no medieval Oprah episode titled "So You Burned Your Cat, A Journey to Forgiveness." But cats, ever the masters of the slow blink and the long game, didn't need a formal rebranding campaign. They just kept doing what they'd always done: kill rats, ignore people, and look fabulous while doing it. The plague had served as an unintentional PR campaign. As more people witnessed firsthand how their cat-free towns became rat-riddled, flea-infested, death-scented wastelands, the logic slowly settled in. Maybe cats weren't Satan's agents. Maybe they were just extremely effective, vaguely judgmental co-workers. You started seeing cats sneak back into households, not as pets, not yet, but as functional tools like mousetraps with better attitude problems. They patrolled granaries, prowled alleys, and took up residence in bakeries, farms, and monasteries. Some cities even had official mouser cats, unofficial employees paid in scraps and occasional affection. It wasn't love, but it was respect, and in cat terms, that's practically a marriage proposal. Their mysterious nature, which had once gotten them accused of whispering sweet nothings to Satan, now became part of their appeal. People began to see cats not as supernatural threats, but as creatures that simply operated on their own plane of existence, aloof, clever, and deeply uninterested in your opinion, which, ironically, made them seem even more divine. In art, cats started making a comeback too. While medieval paintings still occasionally depicted cats as sneaky or mischievous, usually near a tipped-over goblet or a suspicious piece of cheese, others began including them in more domestic and peaceful settings. A cat sitting under a spinning wheel, a kitten nestled beside a fire, a tabby peeking out from under a nun's skirt. Let's not ask too many questions about that one. Slowly the brushstroke of evil gave way to one of affection, and by the time the Renaissance rolled around, cats were no longer public enemies. They were domestic companions. They'd crept back into the family portrait, this time curled at the feet of nobility, licking their paws like they owned the place, which they probably did. Even scholars and scientists began to admire them. French philosopher Michel de Montaigne famously said, "When I play with my cat, how do I know she is not playing with me?" Which sounds like a charming thought, until you remember your cat has probably been plotting your demise for years. Still, the scars of the past lingered. In some areas, superstition remained. Black cats in particular continued to carry a spooky reputation, but now that reputation began to shift from burn it to don't cross its path just in case, which, let's face it, is progress. When people go from committing mass extermination to offering you respectful personal space, that's practically sainthood. Felines also found new champions in unexpected places. Sailors, for instance, brought cats aboard ships to keep rats from eating through ropes and grain. A good ship's cat could mean the difference between a successful voyage and a floating buffet for rodents. These nautical kitties traveled the world, spreading their legend one port at a time, while doing absolutely nothing to disprove their association with mystery and the supernatural. By the early modern period, cats had not only been redeemed, they had been elevated. From the Vatican to village farms, people were once again happy to share their space with a creature that demanded little, cleaned itself, and kept the rats out of the communion wafers. And the cats, they didn't gloat, they didn't protest, they didn't throw a single hissy fit. They just returned, silently, smugly, and completely on their own terms. They slipped back into homes, leapt onto windowsills, and stared down their former enemies like furry little ghosts of judgment past. Because that's the thing about cats. They don't need forgiveness. They don't care if you're sorry. They just want your chair, your chicken, and about 16 hours of uninterrupted sleep. And once they have that, they'll pretend nothing ever happened, even if you once accused them of starting the apocalypse. Cats, the only creatures who can survive mass persecution, reclaim the throne, and act like you were the one being dramatic. History, as the old saying goes, is doomed to repeat itself, especially when people ignore the lessons written in blood, soot, and paw prints. The tale of Pope Gregory the Ninth's war on cats is many things: tragic, bizarre, deeply medieval, But above all, it's a cautionary saga of what happens when irrational fear gets dressed up as policy and paraded through the streets on a float of holy authority. Let's recap the catastrophe, shall we? Step 1. Declare cats demonic. Step 2. Launch a full-scale feline purge. Step 3. Watch rats move in like they've just inherited beachfront property. Step 4. Let fleas ride shotgun. Step 5. Welcome the Black Death. Step 6. Dig graves and wonder what went wrong. It's the kind of historical flowchart that would be hilarious if it hadn't killed an estimated 1/3 to half of Europe's population. That's not just a footnote. That's a full-on disaster movie with a death toll most medieval folks couldn't even count to. And yet what's truly wild is how long it took for anyone to connect the dots. No one sat down and said, ever since we threw whiskers into the river, the pantry's been suspiciously loud at night, and everyone's coughing up organs. The church certainly didn't issue a follow-up papal bull titled "Our Bad, Cats Are Actually Cool." There was no medieval investigative podcast called Serial, The Cat Crusade. There was just silence, and fleas, and a whole lot of very busy gravediggers. The heart of the problem? Fear of the unknown. Gregory de Chions and his inquisitor pen pals saw cats as mysterious, independent, and a little too smug to trust. They didn't understand them, so they burned them. And in doing so, they handed the keys of the continent to creatures that understood exactly how to exploit a world without predators. The next time you see a black cat cross your path, thank it. It's probably saving you from a flea-borne apocalypse. But that's the lesson, isn't it? Demonizing what we don't understand isn't just unfair, it's often dangerous. The history of the cat purge isn't just about animal cruelty or medieval nonsense. It's about how bad ideas, when backed by power, can spiral into catastrophe. And it's about how sometimes your greatest threat isn't the thing hissing under your bed, it's your own refusal to learn. To their credit, eventually, humans started to wise up. Cats made a comeback. People remembered, albeit slowly, that a warm ball of fur with claws was better than a house full of squeaks, chewed rope and flea-based curses, but the real damage had already been done. The Black Death reshaped the face of Europe economically, spiritually, demographically, and all of it could have been at least partially avoided if someone somewhere had just said, what, maybe let the cat live. And yet, we still haven't totally learned. To this day, black cats are the last to be adopted from shelters. They're still tied to superstition, omens, and the occasional bad Halloween prop, which means we've come full circle from blaming them for the plague to dressing them up like they caused it on purpose. So let this tale be your reminder. The next time someone tells you that something is evil because it's different, weird, or not immediately understood, pause, take a breath, ask for evidence, and maybe, just maybe, remember that Europe once tried to cure sin by eliminating cats and ended up with a rodent-based apocalypse. Let's not do that again, because sometimes the villain isn't the cat. Sometimes it's the people lighting the torches. In the end, the only real devil in this story was the one who looked at a purring cat and thought, what this situation needs? Fire. Before airplanes, before helicopters, before hot air balloons, or even common sense, there was one simple, glorious human ambition to fly. Not metaphorically, not in a poetic let's follow our dreams way. No, people wanted to physically remove themselves from the ground and zoom through the air like a goose late for migration. And how did they plan to do this? With absolutely no understanding of aerodynamics, very few materials, and an unshakable sense of confidence that can only be described as terminally optimistic. It all starts, as many ill-fated human ideas do, with mythology. The ancient Greeks gave us Icarus, the poster child for hubris, wing wax, and heat stroke. His dad, Daedalus, crafted wings from feathers and wax so they could escape Crete. The plan was sound. Attach 2 fragile, heat-sensitive wings to your back and take to the sky with no parachute and no plan B. Tragically, and somewhat predictably, Icarus flew too close to the sun, the wax melted, and he plummeted into the sea. The moral? Listen to your father, and maybe wait for the Wright brothers, but the story of Icarus didn't scare humanity off, it inspired them, because if there's anything humans love more than learning from mistakes, it's repeating them with new materials. By the Middle Ages, people across Europe were actively trying to flap their way into the sky. They didn't have engines, they didn't have wind tunnels. What they did have were tall towers, an assortment of barnyard feathers, and a dangerous belief in personal destiny. Early chronicles mention brave, wildly misinformed souls climbing cathedral towers with wings strapped to their arms, looking down at the bustling village square and thinking, this is going to be epic. Seconds later, they would crash into hay carts, thatched roofs, or on one particularly memorable occasion, a bishop's vegetable garden. Flight may not have been achieved, but local entertainment certainly was. In the 9th century, Abbas ibn Firnas, an inventor in what is now Spain, created one of the earliest documented gliders. He reportedly leapt from a tower in Cordoba, wearing wings made from silk and wood. According to the records, he remained in the air for a considerable time, which, in pre-aviation language, might have meant longer than 2 seconds before crash landing and injuring his back, an injury he then blamed on not adding a tail to his design. Minor oversight. He was closer than most, and while he didn't stick the landing, he did stick the idea that flying might one day be more than just a hobby for adrenaline junkies with a death wish. Fast forward to the Renaissance, and the thirst for flight turned from reckless leaping into theoretical leaping. Enter Leonardo da Vinci, the Renaissance man with a sketchbook full of genius and an uncanny ability to design the impossible. Among his notebooks are intricate designs for ornithopters, machines with flapping wings powered by human legs and arms, and vertical screw-like flying devices that resemble modern helicopters. His ideas were revolutionary, his execution purely 2D. Leonardo never built any of them, likely because even he understood that strapping yourself to a wooden contraption and jumping off a cliff is more final act than first flight. Still, Da Vinci's work marked a turning point, the moment when flight began to shift from let's jump and hope to let's study physics first and then still probably crash, but at least with style. His detailed diagrams showed he understood lift, drag, and center of gravity far more than his medieval predecessors, who often skipped straight to the just wing it phase. But despite Da Vinci's blueprints, it would be centuries before anyone took his ideas seriously. Back then, you could invent a tank, sketch out a flying machine, and still die of a mild fever or an accidentally spilled chamber pot. The world wasn't ready. That didn't stop others from trying. In China, there are tales of children strapped to large kites and flown as military experiments, because nothing says national defense like airborne toddlers, and various cultures experimented with gliders and even primitive hot air balloons. These weren't just isolated incidents, they were evidence of a shared human delusion that, no matter how many times people broke their legs or landed in a turnip field, we were meant to fly. Why? Because birds did it. Because angels had wings. Because the sky was there. And humans are genetically incapable of leaving a challenge alone. Flight wasn't just a dream, it was a dare, taken personally by every bored inventor with access to a ladder, a sewing kit, and way too much free time. So before we even get to the engines, the propellers, and the flying machines that look like rejected roller coaster parts, let's raise a toast to the early daredevils, the feather-flapping philosophers, the rooftop philosophers, the unlicensed airborne pioneers who believed, deep down, that a running start and a good pair of boots could defeat gravity. They dreamed of flying. The ground had other ideas. Long before the age of hang gliders and wind tunnels, the earliest pioneers of flight had one crucial thing in common. They had absolutely no idea what they were doing, but what they lacked in physics, materials science, or a basic fear of gravity, they made up for in enthusiasm and feathers. So many feathers. Welcome to the golden age of medieval human-bird cosplay, a time when people genuinely believed that if chickens could flap their way across a barnyard, humans could absolutely launch off a monastery with wooden wings and a prayer. Let's begin with a man whose legacy soars above the rest, if only metaphorically. Aylmer of Malmesbury, an 11th century Benedictine monk, was one of the first known individuals to attempt controlled human flight, inspired by the Greek legend of Daedalus and Icarus, which, in fairness, is literally a cautionary tale. Aylmer fashioned a pair of wings and jumped off the tower of Malmesbury Abbey. His goal: glide gracefully through the sky. The result: glide about 200 meters, then crash and break both legs. The miracle: he lived. The lesson: maybe don't take aviation advice from ancient myths where the main character ends up plummeting into the sea. Now, Aylmer wasn't entirely delusional. He was a monk, yes, but a literate, observant one. He understood that birds achieved flight by having large surface area on their wings and light bodies. He just didn't understand lift, thrust, or how human bones are slightly less aerodynamic than, say, a pigeon. He later admitted his crash was due to the absence of a tail to stabilize his flight, which is honestly impressive self-awareness considering most people in his time blamed disasters on demons or bad bread. But Aylmer was not alone. Across medieval Europe, similar stories flapped their way into the record books and eventually into the ground. In 1496, a man named Siegfried von Feuchtwangs, yes, that's his real name, and not a rejected Dungeons & Dragons character, attempted flight in Nuremberg. Wearing a homemade bird suit stitched with goose feathers, he hurled himself from a tower in front of a crowd, and promptly fell like a sack of potatoes thrown from a trebuchet. Local chronicles state that the man descended in a straight line to earth, which is a very poetic way of saying gravity laughed and did its job. Then there was John Damian, an Italian alchemist, who somehow convinced the court of King James IV of Scotland to let him try flying. Damian believed that if he constructed wings from eagle feathers and wore them like a medieval Red Bull suit, he could soar over the Firth of Forth. He leapt from the walls of Stirling Castle. He landed in a dung heap. His dignity died. But he survived, because nothing cushions an ego like a royal compost pile. Damian later claimed he would have succeeded if only he'd used the right feathers, blaming the fact that some chicken feathers had accidentally made it into the mix, which is possibly the first recorded case of someone blaming poultry for a failed scientific experiment. What these men shared, besides injuries and a shocking disregard for skeletal integrity, was an unwavering belief that bird blueprint. They observed that birds flap wings to fly, so they figured they just had to replicate that behavior. With no understanding of the size-to-mass ratio, they built massive wings that were either too rigid or too floppy, strapped them to their arms and jumped, and every time gravity responded the same way. Nice try. But it wasn't just Europe. Around the same era, in parts of Asia and the Islamic world, flight also captured the imagination. In the 17th century, Hezarfen Ahmed Çelebi in the Ottoman Empire reportedly flew from the Galata Tower in Istanbul using artificial wings. Accounts claim he glided several kilometers across the Bosporus before landing safely. Historians debate how much of this is truth and how much is patriotic myth, but the story endures because it feels like the kind of thing someone in that era would absolutely try, preferably before anyone could talk them out of it. It's worth noting that despite the failure rate roughly 100%, these feathered fools laid the psychological groundwork for real aviation. They pushed the idea that humans weren't bound to the earth. Sure, they didn't exactly understand the sky, but they stared it down, tied on their wings, and said, "Let's see what happens." And what happened was mostly injuries. They didn't know about lift. They didn't know about airflow. They definitely didn't know about terminal velocity. But they had heart, they had guts, they had access to roofs, and most importantly, they had the sheer, unbreakable conviction that if birds can fly 12 feet, then humans should at least make it 6. Spoiler, physics disagreed. If ambition had a face in the Renaissance, it would look suspiciously like a bearded man holding a sketch pad and surrounded by gears, guts, and questionable gliders. That man, Leonardo da Vinci, a polymath who spent his time dissecting cadavers in the morning, painting timeless masterpieces in the afternoon, and casually inventing futuristic flying machines before dinner. To call Leonardo ahead of his time is like saying the moon is slightly elevated. He was hundreds of years early to conversations about robotics, hydraulics, and yes, aviation. While most people in the 15th century were busy surviving plagues or trying to count past 20, Da Vinci was asking questions like, what if man had wings? And more dangerously, how hard could it be? Spoiler, very hard. Let's start with the Ornithopter, Leonardo's most iconic flying concept. It looked like something between a giant mechanical bat and the world's least comfortable rowing machine. The idea was to mimic the flapping motion of birds using human arm and leg strength. Leonardo envisioned a pilot lying face down on a wooden frame, flapping massive wings by pedaling with their feet and pulling on hand levers. It was beautiful, elegant, visually striking, and utterly doomed. The issue? Humans are, biologically speaking, terrible birds. Our chest muscles weren't built for flapping wings the size of a small sailboat. The average pigeon weighs about 300 grams and has hollow bones. The average 15th century Italian probably weighed more and had bones full of pasta and ambition. No matter how intricate the design, Leonardo had unwittingly designed a machine that looked like it could fly, as long as nobody ever tried, which is exactly what happened. Despite all his aviation sketches, Leonardo never built a full-scale version of any of them. Not the Ornithopter, not the spinning aerial screw, more on that in a second, not even the parachute he cleverly sketched using a pyramid-shaped canopy. Some historians speculate that he didn't have the resources, others believe he lacked the materials, but most likely, Leonardo was smart enough to know he would absolutely die if he jumped off a cliff in one of his own inventions. Genius isn't just designing the machine, it's also recognizing when the machine is going to yeet you directly into a tree. Now, about that aerial screw. Picture a giant corkscrew made of linen stretched over a wooden frame, designed to spin rapidly and screw its way into the air. It's often hailed as an early conceptual model for the modern helicopter. There's just one small hiccup. Helicopters need rotors, engines, and lift. Leonardo's model had none of those. What it did have was rotational energy, a fancy spiral design, and a one-way ticket to disappointment. If you'd tried to spin it by hand fast enough to generate lift, you'd likely have pulled a hamstring before getting an inch off the ground. It's more likely it would have spun in place and drilled the pilot into the dirt like a confused corkscrew trying to escape the bottle from the wrong end. But again, to Leonardo's credit, he didn't test it. He theorized. He drew. He made notes in mirrored handwriting, because apparently writing left to right like a normal person just wasn't his thing. And in those notebooks he included measurements, principles of air resistance, and musings on center of gravity, all of which were shockingly accurate for someone born before Newton, long before Bernoulli, and way before the term aerodynamics had ever been tossed around by men with clipboards. Leonardo da Vinci understood the basic physics of flight in ways that nobody else did for centuries. He observed birds in detail, noting how they adjusted their wings to control direction and speed. He calculated lift and drag long before calculators. In fact, he was one of the first to suggest that air behaves like a fluid, an idea that would eventually underpin modern aviation theory. But while his science was groundbreaking, his reality was still 15th century Italy. No aluminium, no lightweight polymers, no reliable engines, just wood, cloth, rope, and a whole lot of Renaissance gumption. In that way, Leonardo's flying machines were less experimental aircraft and more engineering fan fiction. He imagined the sky as something conquerable, something artistic, even romantic. His machines didn't work, but they inspired. His drawings spread like wildfire through future generations of tinkerers, inventors, and people with far worse risk assessment skills. And that's really the magic of Leonardo da Vinci. He made failure look like part of the process, not the end of it. He sketched a world that wasn't ready to exist yet, and then just went back to painting the Last Supper like it was no big deal. Leonardo gave us art, anatomy, and aircraft sketches that screamed, "Do not attempt this at home," and nobody did, not because they weren't tempted, but because even the boldest lunatics of the era looked at his Ornithopter and went, "Yeah, no, I'd like to keep my spine intact." The 18th century, an era of powdered wigs, revolutionary thinking, and absolutely no concept of safety regulations. While philosophers were busy writing treatises on liberty and reason, other people were standing on rooftops with open umbrellas, looking at the sky and thinking, "Yeah, I got this." Welcome to the brief but spectacular age when umbrellas were misidentified as parachutes, balloons were treated like party tricks, and airspace laws were basically whoever floats flies. Let's start with the umbrella enthusiasts. In theory, a large umbrella resembles a parachute. In reality, one is designed to stop rain, the other is designed to stop terminal velocity. That small difference became very clear when people began testing their umbrella-based escape plans from increasingly higher altitudes. Take Robert Cocking, a British painter and part-time death defier. In 1837, he designed a parachute shaped like an inverted umbrella, convinced it would descend slowly from a hot air balloon. He ascended nearly 5,000 feet in the air and then plummeted rapidly when his umbrella immediately collapsed like a wet taco. He died on impact, becoming the first parachuting fatality in history. The moral? Never trust an umbrella for anything more than keeping your powdered wig dry. But umbrella optimism wasn't confined to professionals. Paris in the late 1700s was practically theatre for these experiments. Street performers, inventors, and vaguely confident lunatics would jump from low rooftops holding parasols, hoping to drift gently to earth. The result? Usually a broken ankle and an impromptu crowd reaction that hovered somewhere between horror and applause. This was the age of enlightenment, but apparently nobody told gravity. While umbrella jumpers were bruising their way through town squares, another trend was quite literally taking off: balloon mania. And it all began with fire, fabric, and two brothers with a dream, and again no safety harnesses. Enter the Montgolfier brothers, Joseph and Etienne, the paper-making siblings who in 1783 sent a sheep, a duck, and a rooster into the sky in a hot air balloon. Their goal? See if living things could survive flight. They chose animals based on scientific reasoning, and also probably which ones were easiest to catch. The flight was a success. The animals lived. The duck reportedly complained about the in-flight service, but everyone was thrilled. Encouraged, the brothers then sent up people, including one brave man in a balloon held aloft by burning straw and wool. Think about that. Fire inside a giant flammable balloon. It's not so much a transportation method as it is a gentleman's slow-motion fire trap. Still, it was glorious. It was poetic. It was very French. Unfortunately, once the balloon was in the sky, there was no real way to steer it. Early balloonists would drift wherever the wind took them, sometimes landing miles away from their launch point in enemy territory, or directly into forests. One poor soul drifted over the countryside and was nearly beaten by terrified farmers who thought he was a demon descending from the heavens. In fairness, if you'd never seen a balloon and suddenly one started falling from the sky carrying a man in silk pants and a powdered wig, you'd panic too. Some balloonists found themselves blown into thunderstorms, where the results ranged from very wet to electrifyingly tragic. Others collided with church steeples, chimneys, or military installations, which tended to result in swift introductions to cannon fire. Nothing says oops like floating into restricted airspace during a siege, and yet despite the crashes, explosions, and occasional barn landings, ballooning became wildly popular. In England and France, crowds gathered in droves to watch men ascend into the heavens like gods of silk and smoke. Some took picnics, some prayed, some placed bets on which nearby tree the balloonist would eventually get tangled in. A new profession emerged, the aeronaut. These were equal parts scientist, stuntman, and daredevil, often dressed like dandies and writing poetic letters from the clouds while desperately trying to avoid drifting into the ocean. Balloon flights were advertised as spectacles, and many ended with what became known as the balloonist's crawl, the very dignified process of climbing out of a deflated balloon while covered in soot and sheep dung, then asking for directions home. Interestingly, the Enlightenment thinkers were divided. Some hailed ballooning as the future of transport. Others, like Benjamin Franklin, watched a flight in Paris and famously said, "What use is a newborn baby?" meaning it's new. It's fascinating, and you have no idea what it's going to grow into, but it sure makes a lot of noise and accidents. What ballooning proved, perhaps more than anything else, was that humans could get into the sky, but getting back down gracefully was still a work in progress. The 18th century didn't bring us powered flight, but it delivered something just as vital: the proof that humans would keep climbing higher, no matter how many rooftops, farms, or thunderclouds they bounced off of. They brought umbrellas, they brought fire, they brought fashion-forward optimism and safety protocols. They brought those never. If there's one thing history teaches us, it's this: give a man a sewing kit, a healthy dose of delusion, and access to a tall structure, and he will try to become a bird. By the 1800s, this idea evolved beyond feather and hope contraptions into something far more fashionable: the wingsuit. Yes, that's right. The 19th century gave birth to an entire generation of airborne enthusiasts who sincerely believed that all it took to defy gravity was a stylish jacket with flaps sewn into it. Welcome to the great wingsuit epidemic of the 1800s, a period where tailors became unwitting accomplices in the aviation arms race, and bridges were used less for crossing and more for launching. The concept was simple, in the same way that let's build a rocket in our backyard is simple. Early wingsuit inventors looked at bats, flying squirrels, and occasionally circus acrobats and thought, that could be me. And instead of studying aerodynamics or designing gliders, they went straight to the wardrobe. These Batmen, not the crime-fighting kind, more the crash into a market stall kind, would commission suits with wing-like extensions sewn between their arms and torsos. Some were made of silk, some of canvas, and all were deeply optimistic. The plan? Leap from a high place and let the flaps catch air, creating enough drag and lift to slow their descent. The reality? They mostly flopped around like airborne laundry, and then slammed into the ground like sacks of rebellious ham. One of the most enthusiastic launch pads of the era was Paris, which, between its architectural elegance and love of public spectacle, became ground zero for wingsuit tests. The city's bridges, towers, and even cathedrals served as runways for aspiring human pigeons. But no story sums up the era quite like that of Franz Reichelt, an Austrian-born tailor living in Paris who believed he could combine fashion and flight into one glorious parachuting coat. Reichelt was absolutely convinced that his invention, part trench coat, part death trap, would revolutionize aviation safety. So in 1912, with a full crowd and rolling film cameras, he climbed to the first platform of the Eiffel Tower and prepared to test it himself. Let's pause here. Several things should raise alarms. He had never successfully tested the suit. His previous dummies had all hit the ground like overripe watermelons. He was wearing it himself. When officials asked if he wanted to use a mannequin, Reichelt declined. No need, he said, possibly while adjusting the flaps of doom sewn under his arms. Moments later, in front of a silent crowd, he leapt from 57 meters above the Champ de Mars. He fell like a stone. Reichelt's invention did not open like a parachute. Instead, it clung to his body like a fashion-forward straitjacket and delivered him directly into the pavement below. The tragic incident was recorded on early film and became one of the first aviation deaths captured on camera, and one of the most chilling reminders that fashion does not equal function, especially at terminal velocity. And yet, even after Reichelt, the wingsuit dream didn't die. Across Europe, inventors kept stitching flaps and panels onto jackets and leaping from increasingly ill-advised platforms. Some tried to inflate their suits with air, creating what one man called parachute pants decades before MC Hammer. Others added stiffeners, wires, rods, even whalebone to keep their wings spread. The results? Mostly splat-shaped. One Italian enthusiast built a suit using parchment, thinking it would catch air better than silk. It did not. It caught fire instead during a demonstration. Another man in Germany tried a wax-coated canvas suit. It worked fine until the wax melted under the sun mid-jump and his wings folded like soggy crepes. Still, these inventors weren't entirely mad. They were just early. The principle of the wingsuit, using human body shape and surface area to create lift and reduce speed, actually works. Modern wingsuit flyers can soar horizontally at great speeds and glide for miles, but that only became possible with materials like nylon, aerodynamic modeling, and most importantly, parachutes as a backup. In the 1800s, there were no backups. There were only brave men, tall ledges and jackets stitched by tailors who definitely should have asked more questions. Will you be attending an event, monsieur? Yes, gravity. I'm going to fight it. By the end of the century, wingsuit attempts became less common. Not because people stopped dreaming, but because they realized there were better ways to fly, like with balloons, airships, or just waiting for someone else to go first. But the 1800s gave us something irreplaceable. A look into the human psyche that said, yes, I've seen birds, I've seen bats, now hold my needle and thread. Every tailor in Europe had a customer who wanted to fly like a bat. None of them returned for a second fitting. The 19th century was a time of unstoppable industrial optimism. Trains were conquering continents, factories were belching out progress, and everything that could be riveted, cranked, or pressurized was it was the golden age of gears, levers, and the completely unshakable belief that steam could solve anything. Transportation, warfare, tea time. So naturally, someone looked at a steam engine and thought, you know what this needs? Wings. Welcome to the short-lived, loud, and occasionally flammable era of steam-powered flying machines, a time when aviation dreams were built from iron, fueled by coal, and only slightly less aerodynamic than a barn. Let's be clear, steam engines were already powering massive vehicles on land and water. Trains roared across countries, steamships ruled the seas, so it made a strange kind of sense if you could move something across the earth with a cloud of boiling pressure and a very loud whistle, surely you could send it into the sky. Right? Spoiler, you could not. One of the earliest steam-fueled hopefuls was William Henson, a British inventor who in the 1840s proposed the aerial steam carriage, a giant fixed-wing monoplane powered by a lightweight steam engine. Well, lightweight by Victorian standards, which meant only marginally lighter than a blacksmith's entire shed. The aerial steam carriage was never fully built, but the drawings looked magnificent. Elegant wings, a long fuselage, and the promise of quiet, luxurious travel through the skies. In reality, the thing had zero chance of lifting off the ground unless someone strapped it to a dozen pigeons and hoped for the best. But Henson's dream lit a spark, and that spark landed on boiling water. Soon after, inventors across Europe and America began building steam-powered contraptions that looked less like flying machines and more like early transformers having a bad day. Most of these early airships failed to account for a basic issue. Steam engines are heavy, like crush your hopes and also your pilot heavy. For a steam-powered aircraft to take off, it needed to be light enough to fly, strong enough to hold a boiler, and reliable enough not to explode in mid-air. Unfortunately, they typically achieved none of these things. Take Félix du Temple, a French naval officer who, in the 1870s, actually managed to build one of the first steam-powered aircraft that left the ground barely. And the pose, creation made of aluminum and powered by a tiny steam engine, achieved a short hop down a slope before gracefully returning to Earth like a confused penguin. While it may not have soared, it was one of the first machines to demonstrate powered lift, even if only for a glorious half-second. Du Temple's machine was a mechanical marvel, but it also barely worked when conditions were perfect. Add wind, humidity, or an unlucky sneeze from the pilot, and the whole thing would either stall or tip over dramatically. But compared to others at the time, it was a soaring success. Enter Alexander Mojajski, a Russian naval officer who built one of the world's earliest powered aircraft in the 1880s. His creation was massive, roughly 75 feet long, with steam engines spinning 2 propellers. He launched it down a wooden ramp and claimed it flew. Critics argued it fell with conviction. Regardless, the engines were too weak for sustained flight, and the design was more optimistic sculpture than functional aircraft. Mojajski's machine didn't fly so much as it aggressively reminded the Earth it existed. Many others followed. Some mounted steam engines onto dirigibles, turning them into floating kettles prone to overheating, leaking, or catching fire mid-air. Others tried to make ornithopters flap using steam pistons. You know what happens when you add steam pressure to fragile wood and canvas? You build a very elaborate smoke bomb. One engineer's workshop exploded during testing, sending the boiler through the roof and scaring every horse in a 4-block radius. That was his third attempt, and yet nobody stopped to ask, should we be doing this? Because steam wasn't just a fuel, it was an ideology. It meant progress. It meant invention. It meant we can absolutely boil our way to the stratosphere. Never mind the fact that these flying machines took 45 minutes to warm up, emitted enough smoke to trigger a citywide panic, and weighed more than the castles they launched from. Engineers believed in steam, and nothing, especially not gravity, was going to stop them. To be fair, their efforts weren't entirely in vain. These early attempts introduced crucial concepts: the importance of power-to-weight ratios, the limits of fuel-based thrust, and perhaps most critically, the need to invent something better than steam. They thought if steam could power trains, it could power wings. Instead, it mostly powered explosions, but in their failures they taught future aviators what not to do. Don't strap a kettle to a kite, don't ride a pressure tank downhill and call it flight. And maybe, just maybe, stop putting flammable engines inside things that are supposed to gently glide. So here's to the steam dreamers, the soot-covered, gear-turning, ever-hissing hopefuls who thought the sky could be conquered by coal and confidence. They may not have flown far, but they absolutely launched the idea with fire, and sometimes a bang. There's a certain logic to early flight attempts that only works if you ignore everything we've learnt since kindergarten biology. Humans looked at birds, saw them flapping happily through the sky, and thought, hey, if they can do it, so can I. Which is a bold take from a species that struggles to climb stairs without breathing heavily. Welcome to the golden age of copy-the-bird aviation, a period in history where science took a hard left and decided that mimicry, mastery. The results? Wing-flapping contraptions that filled the skies with dreams and the hillsides with debris. Let's begin with the flawed premise. Birds can fly, therefore humans can fly if they just act like birds. Seems reasonable, until you remember that birds evolved for millions of years to do this. They have lightweight, hollow bones, a unique respiratory system, and muscles built specifically for sustained flapping. Humans have none of that. What we do have are dense skeletons, questionable upper body strength, and a habit of grossly overestimating ourselves when ladders are involved. But try telling that to a 19th century inventor standing on a barn roof wearing a beak and 12-foot mechanical wings. Because for decades this flawed thinking became the blueprint for manned flight. And when we say blueprint, we mean a series of hastily drawn diagrams that all ended in thud. These inventors were often referred to as ornithopters. Not the machines, the people themselves. They built devices with giant flapping wings, sometimes using levers or foot pedals, other times just strapping them to their arms like a festive goose costume and leaping with gusto. The common thread? They all assumed flapping slying. The actual result? Flapping falling stylishly. For about 2 seconds, one of the best examples comes from Germany, where hilly regions like Bavaria saw a minor epidemic of wing-related enthusiasm. Local newspapers even documented competitions. Yes, competitions, where men would try to launch from hillsides using homemade bird wings. There was one famous participant known only as the Tailor of Ulm, who believed God had given him the divine insight to fly. His contraption? Massive wooden wings with canvas stretched over them, powered entirely by the human desire to flap harder than gravity. He leapt from a church tower in 1811. He landed immediately after. A priest reportedly blessed him on the way down, which, while spiritually comforting, didn't help with the landing velocity. Meanwhile, in other parts of Europe, inventors weren't just copying birds, they were copying chickens, which, for those keeping score at home, are not known for their majestic soaring abilities. Chickens fly like toddlers run, mostly in one direction and always into something, but the logic went like this. If a chicken can fly 5 feet, maybe a man can fly 5 yards. And so the barn test was born. Dozens of brave but tragically misguided individuals climbed barns with giant wings strapped to their arms, ran full speed, and flapped furiously on the way down. Occasionally, they managed to glide for a few feet. Mostly, they just added new dents to the family farm. These moments were so common that some villages began posting signs discouraging aerial attempts from haylofts. You know you've reached a certain level of community trauma when your barn requires anti-flight signage. The fundamental problem? Flapping is incredibly inefficient, even for birds. Most birds don't flap continuously. They glide, soar, and let physics do a lot of the work. Humans trying to manually flap wings larger than their body usually found themselves exhausted before they even reached the edge. One inventor fainted mid-flap, tumbled off the platform, and only survived because he crashed into his own hay delivery cart. There were attempts to make the wings mechanical, of course. Inventors added springs, gears, and foot pedals. One French engineer even connected his Ornithopter to a treadmill-like system, which would have been impressive if he hadn't launched it straight into a vineyard during harvest season. The only thing flying that day was a series of angry wine bottles. But despite the constant splats, scrapes, and skeptical cows, the bird mimicry movement continued. Why? Because birds made it look so easy. A sparrow could dip, dive, and roll in mid-air like a feathered fighter jet. Meanwhile, a human with a 14-foot plywood wingspan could barely balance on the launch ramp without knocking over his own support team. Eventually, science caught up and realized what evolution had been whispering the whole time. Birds are biologically specialized flying machines, and humans are not. No amount of feather stitching, arm flapping, or motivational yelling from villagers below was going to change that. Still, these early flappers gave something valuable to aviation history. The knowledge that just because you look like a bird doesn't mean you'll land like one. If you ever want to appreciate evolution, watch a grown man try to flap his way off a barn. By the early 20th century, the landscape of human flight looked more like a battlefield than a breakthrough. Barns had wings poking out of their roofs. Hillsides were littered with busted gliders and bent monocles. Tailors were quietly refusing to sew another set of bat wings for anyone named Pierre. The skies were still a dream, but at ground level things were getting very expensive and very embarrassing. Enter Wilbur and Orville Wright, two quiet bicycle mechanics from Dayton, Ohio, who watched the chaos from afar and said, "What if we didn't do all of that?" While everyone else was strapping engines to rocking chairs and hurling themselves off towers with all the confidence of a brick, the Wright brothers decided to try something radical: science, patience, and not immediately jumping off a roof with a kite taped to their back. It's hard to overstate how methodical the Wrights were. They weren't aristocrats, daredevils, or guys with a wealthy patron funding their aerial trousers. They were tinkerers with a bike shop, a love of mechanics, and a deeply unfashionable tendency to test things before climbing into them. Their first experiments didn't involve dramatic jumps or stylish capes. Instead, they involved wind tunnels, dozens of glider tests, and a borderline obsessive focus on lift, drag, and control. Let's pause there, because control was the thing most inventors had ignored, if they even remembered to build wings in the same shape. Early flyers were so fixated on getting off the ground that they rarely thought about what to do once they were up there. Their attitude was usually, "I'll figure it out once I'm airborne." Spoiler, they didn't. The Wrights understood that flight wasn't just about brute force or flapping, it was about balance, so they studied birds not just for their wings, but for their ability to adjust in mid-air. They noticed how birds tilted, banked, and corrected themselves with subtle wing movements. And instead of slapping those ideas onto a homemade bird costume, they applied them to their gliders, introducing something revolutionary: 3-axis control. 3-axis control meant pitch, up and down, roll side to side, and yaw, left and right, the holy trinity of not dying in mid-air. To manage it, the Wright brothers invented a forward elevator for pitch, wing warping for roll, and a rear rudder for yaw. It was like steering a bicycle, except the handlebars were made of canvas and your other option was face first into the sand dunes. Speaking of sand dunes, let's talk about Kitty Hawk, North Carolina, the testing ground for the Wright brothers' flying machines and possibly the windiest, sandiest mistake for giving place in the United States. They chose it because it offered strong winds, soft landings, and not too many witnesses. In case something caught fire or exploded, which in aviation was still very much a possibility. By 1902, the Wrights had built a glider with effective control, but they knew that gliding wasn't the end game, so they built a custom wind tunnel out of wood and cardboard to test over 200 different wing shapes. That's right, while everyone else was yelling "Eureka" from rooftops. Wilbur and Orville were hunched over a fan and measuring airflow with kitchen scales. Then came 1903. Their new machine, the Flyer, was made of spruce wood and muslin fabric, had a 12-horsepower engine, twin propellers, and a 40-foot wingspan. It looked more like a fancy picnic table than a plane, but it flew. On December 17, 1903, Orville made the first powered, controlled, sustained flight in human history, 120 feet in 12 seconds. It wasn't majestic. It wasn't even that high, but it was the first time humanity had told gravity, "Not today," and gotten away with it. And unlike their predecessors, the Wright brothers didn't immediately launch from a castle or wear a top hat while doing it. They took turns flying. They repaired the Flyer between tests. They logged everything. They even knew what went wrong when things went wrong because they were keeping notes, not just hospital bills. They succeeded not because they were geniuses, though they were, but because they did something nearly every failed flyer before them had refused to do. They learned from the failures. They looked at the carnage of umbrella jumpers, steam-powered anvils, and bat-suited dreamers and thought, maybe we don't want to be the next cautionary tale. Instead of a spectacle, they built a system. Instead of hurling themselves at the sky, they studied it, and instead of trusting in luck, they trusted in lift coefficients. Their triumph wasn't just a mechanical victory, it was a philosophical one. It proved that flight wasn't a magic trick or a suicide pact with feathers, it was a solvable problem. They didn't invent the dream of flight, but they gave it structure, they gave it stability, they gave it notes, and in doing so they quietly ended centuries of loud, painful and occasionally flaming attempts at leaving the Earth. By the time Orville Wright made his 12-second hop into aviation history in 1903, the Earth had already claimed a long list of enthusiastic, often airborne dreamers. These weren't failures in the ordinary sense. These were men, and the occasional goat in a test basket, who hurled themselves at the sky with confidence, creativity, and exactly zero understanding of lift-to-drag ratios. And yet, despite the bruises, busted ribs, and bruised egos, every one of them mattered, because each crash wasn't just an ending, it was a lesson, sometimes written in broken wood, sometimes in local newspaper headlines like "Inventor flaps into chicken coop," but always offering humanity a bit more understanding about the stubborn mechanics of flight. Let's be honest, no one nailed it on the first try. Flight wasn't a light bulb moment, it was a centuries-long group project, one where nobody read the assignment, everyone brought a different idea, and gravity played the strict teacher who failed everyone equally. So what did all those airborne misadventures teach us? First and foremost, gravity doesn't negotiate. No matter how enthusiastic the inventor, how colorful the wing fabric, or how many pigeons you studied, gravity didn't care. It made no exceptions. You jumped, it pulled, and the lesson? If you want to defeat it, even briefly, you better come prepared with more than just optimism and an old bedsheet. Early failures exposed the brutal math behind flight. They taught future inventors about weight distribution. You can't just bolt wings to a bathtub, thrust-to-weight ratios, your steam-powered flying anvil won't take off, and the dangers of forgetting landing gear entirely. Every crash was an experiment that narrowed the possibilities and eventually carved a path forward. They also taught a lot about materials science, often in the worst way possible. From flammable silk wings to iron boilers mounted on flimsy frames, many inventors learned through painful demonstration that heavier does not mean better. Sturdy doesn't help when you're supposed to be airborne. One particular 19th century design had a fully reinforced cabin, complete with velvet seating and brass trim, but forgot to factor in that it weighed more than a small elephant. Spoiler, it didn't fly, it didn't even roll. But perhaps the most important lesson these early failures taught us was this: dreaming big means falling hard and getting up smarter. Without those first misguided leaps from towers, hills, and balconies, there would be no reason for people like the Wright brothers to approach flight with caution and calculation. It's easy to see the 12-second flight at Kitty Hawk as the start of aviation, but in truth it was the end of a long, painful learning curve paved by people who flapped first and asked questions later. The truth is, science doesn't always move forward by success. Sometimes it lurches ahead because someone said, "What if we tie 800 pigeons to a glider?" and then had to explain the results to a very concerned town mayor. Every failed flight was a contribution, a chapter in the unintentional textbook of what not to do. It's not just physics and engineering they taught us either. They taught us about human nature, our tireless belief that we could fly, even when everything around us, including the emergency physician, said otherwise. There's something undeniably noble, if not slightly unhinged, about people who build giant wings in their basements and announce, "I'm going to make history," or a crater. But here's the twist: they did make history. They didn't fly, but they launched humanity toward the sky, usually face first, and their contribution wasn't measured in miles flown or records broken, but in barriers shattered, social barriers, mental barriers, the kind that say, humans aren't meant to leave the ground. These early inventors challenged that with every absurdly flappy contraption they dared to strap to their torsos. Their impact lingers in every cockpit and airport today. In every safety manual, you can hear echoes of the past. Don't light a fire near the fuel source. Always test your equipment. And feathers alone do not constitute aviation-grade materials. Lessons hard won by people who quite literally hit the ground running, and then tumbling, and then groaning. Modern flight, the jumbo jets, helicopters, space shuttles, drones delivering your snacks, is built on a foundation not just of knowledge and innovation, but of pure unfiltered trial and error. And for every successful flight today, there's a long-forgotten inventor in a 19th century field somewhere, flapping a giant canvas wing while yelling, "Tell my tailor I was right." So raise a metaphorical glass, or maybe a roll of bandages, to the forgotten flyers, the sky gazers, the flappers, floaters, and fearless face planters. They dared to believe the ground was optional, and even when it wasn't, they got us one step closer to the day it finally was. Before he became the walking disaster that would steamroll an empire, Hernan Cortez was just your average 15th century overachiever. Minus the wealth, prospects, or any discernible chill, born in 1485 in the small Spanish town of Medellin, Cortez came into the world with little more than a family name, a mild case of noble blood, and an ego that could fill a cathedral. He wasn't royalty, he wasn't rich, but what he lacked in social standing, he made up for in a personality that screamed, "You will remember me, or else." Cortez was part of Spain's lesser nobility, what you might call the discount aristocrats. They had titles, sure, but not the kind that came with lands, riches, or any power that couldn't be laughed out of a courtroom. In modern terms, he was born just important enough to feel entitled, but not important enough for anyone else to care. So naturally, he did what every dangerously ambitious young man does when the local job market is tight. He looked for opportunity overseas, preferably the kind that involved gold, glory, and very few accountability measures. This was the age of exploration, after all. A time when Europe was collectively looking at the map, realizing there were still blank parts, and deciding they should go fix that. Spain and Portugal were the lead players in this world tour of discovering places already inhabited, and the rules were basically, bring religion, take riches, ask forgiveness later. For the adventurous European man in the early 1500s, the New World wasn't just a chance for a fresh start. It was a choose-your-own conquest simulator, and business was booming. The vibe of the age was something like, "Are you brave? Ruthless? slightly literate. Do you own a sword and have minimal concern for indigenous sovereignty? Congratulations, you're hired. So where did Cortez fit into this? Picture a man with major main character energy, the kind who saw a globe and thought, I bet I could plant my flag on half of that. He was smart, charismatic, stubborn to a fault, and had the kind of religious zeal that made priests nervous. What he lacked in diplomacy, he made up for in absolute, unshakable confidence. The man could walk into a volcano and argue it was the volcano's fault for being in his way. But Cortez didn't come fully formed from the womb in armor. He started his rise as many young nobles did, by being sent to university at age 14 to study law. Naturally, he dropped out after 2 years. Not because he lacked talent, but because book learning is slow and Cortez preferred results. Legend has it he caught an illness, possibly boredom, left his studies, and started chasing stories of the Americas instead. It was a perfect storm. Spain had just finished kicking the Moors out of Granada in 1492. The Reconquista was over, and thousands of soldiers, knights, and wannabe heroes suddenly found themselves unemployed and very eager to try conquest somewhere new. Conveniently, that same year, Columbus discovered the New World and Europe lost its collective mind. A whole hemisphere had just been added to the menu, and Cortez showed up with a fork and knife. He headed to Hispaniola around 1504, hungry for action. What he found was chaos, opportunity, and the kind of get-rich-or-die-trying atmosphere that would make Wall Street blush. It was here he got his first taste of colonial politics, land grabbing, and the fine art of looking loyal while quietly preparing to overtake your superior. Think of it as apprenticeship in ambition, and Cortez graduated with honors. He wasn't particularly loyal, but he was incredibly persuasive. He had a gift for turning allies into assets and rivals into afterthoughts. Every room he walked into, he walked out of with more than he had before, unless the room was on fire, which, to be fair, happened a lot back then. And he was charming, dangerously so, enough that he could convince men to follow him into uncharted territory with the promise of maybe gold and maybe death, enough that he could earn the trust of superiors and then swiftly betray it in a way that somehow made them look foolish. Cortez didn't just break rules. He made rule-breaking look like divine destiny, and perhaps that's the real reason he rose so quickly. He was born in the one historical moment where being wildly ambitious, mildly educated, morally elastic, and good with a sword made you a hero instead of a headline. In Cortez, Spain got exactly what it had ordered from the Age of Exploration menu. A man who would go as far as necessary, and usually farther. He wasn't born into greatness, but he fully intended to drag history by the collar until it noticed him. Or, as history would later record, Cortez wasn't born wealthy, but he was born with that dangerous mix of charm and the inability to take no from God. By the early 1500s, Hernan Cortez had officially arrived in the New World, and so had his ambitions. After disembarking in Hispaniola around 1504, he began doing what every bright-eyed young conquistador did to prove his worth: participate in colonial expansion, dodge tropical diseases, and make as many power-hungry friends as possible without getting stabbed in the back or doing the stabbing himself. Sometimes both happened, often on the same day, but if Hispaniola was the warm-up round, Cuba was the real audition. Spain had recently set its sights on the lush island, which was inconveniently already home to indigenous Taino people, who had the misfortune of living somewhere the Spanish decided looked promising. And when Spain wanted something promising, it sent people like Diego Velázquez, a man tasked with conquering the place, organizing settlements, and making sure someone else got blamed when things went wrong. Cortez wasn't in charge yet. At this point he was working under Velázquez, the seasoned governor of the island, and the man who would one day regret that deeply. Velázquez liked Cortez at first. The younger man was clever, useful, and willing to charm, bribe, or cajole just about anyone. For a governor managing a volatile colony with not enough supplies, too many swords, and an abundance of heat stroke, having Cortez around was like hiring an intern who could also lead a cavalry charge. The conquest of Cuba was a crash course in colonial administration. Cortez learned how to manage settlements, negotiate badly with indigenous leaders, and divvy up land, labor, and loyalties, all while making sure his name climbed the social ladder faster than the bodies piled up. And let's not sugarcoat it. The colonization of Cuba was brutal. Spanish forces enslaved native populations under the encomienda system, which was less mutually beneficial partnership and more you work until you drop, then we baptize your corpse. But what Cortez really learned in Cuba wasn't farming or governance. It was the fine art of political maneuvering and survival in a backstabbing buffet. In a world where loyalty lasted until lunchtime and everyone carried a sword, Cortez mastered the colonial version of office. Keep allies close but not too successful. Charm your way out of punishment or into command. Betrayal is just leadership with extra confidence. He was given a fair amount of responsibility. Land, a modest title, even a bit of wealth. But that wasn't enough. Cortez wanted more, and he wasn't the type to wait for a promotion. At one point he even got engaged to Velázquez's sister-in-law, which may or may not have been out of love, and may or may not have been a strategy to ensure Velázquez kept him around. Spoiler, it didn't work. Their relationship eventually soured like spoiled cassava, mostly because Cortez couldn't resist plotting behind Velázquez's back. He began aligning himself with other colonists who were frustrated with Velázquez's leadership, and before long the charming young noble with the sharp smile had become a walking red flag in armor. As one contemporary might have whispered after a tense council meeting, he went to the Caribbean to make a name for himself. Unfortunately, that name became "Please don't let him be in charge." To Velázquez's credit, he did try to rein Cortez in, multiple times. He gave him missions, revoked them, reinstated them, and at one point had him imprisoned for insubordination. Cortez, of course, escaped, probably with the help of someone he'd charmed, bribed, or both. The man was a human cheat code for colonial authority, too valuable to execute, too dangerous to ignore. Still, Cortez always managed to land on his feet, like a very determined cat with a sword and a taste for politics. Even after Velázquez tried to keep him in check, he wound up naming Cortez the leader of an expedition to the Mexican mainland. Why? Because at the end of the day, Cortez could do one thing better than anyone else: get results. Messy, controversial, high body count results, but results nonetheless. Cuba gave Cortez the perfect rehearsal for what was to come. He watched how fragile alliances could topple nations. He learned that native resistance could be crushed not just with weapons, but with manipulation and misinformation. And most importantly, he saw that the Spanish crown didn't really care how you got rich, as long as you remembered to send a cut back to Madrid. So by the time Cortez was standing on the coast of Cuba, loading his ships and ignoring Velázquez's last-minute panic to stop him, he wasn't just a rogue explorer anymore. He was a fully evolved conquistador, equal parts military commander, politician, religious crusader, and wild-card sociopath. The jungle hadn't just welcomed him, it had trained him, and next, he had his sights set on a land filled with gold, pyramids, and people who had absolutely no idea what kind of trouble was sailing their way. If history were a board game, Hernan Cortez played like the guy who flipped the board, stole the dice, and declared himself the winner while everyone else was still reading the rules. And never was this more obvious than in 1519, when he decided against the explicit orders of his boss, Diego Velázquez, to launch a full-blown military expedition to Mexico. This wasn't a minor insubordination. It was like being told, "Don't touch the cake," and Cortez not only ate the cake, he baked a second one, threw it at a neighboring king, and claimed it in the name of Spain. Here's what happened. After years in Cuba, Velázquez reluctantly gave Cortez permission to lead a reconnaissance mission to the Yucatan Peninsula. Just a little fact-finding, they said. Don't start anything, they said. Cortez, of course, heard none of that. The moment he was granted command, he began stockpiling ships, men, weapons, and just a touch of divine arrogance. It didn't take Velázquez long to realize that giving Cortez any authority was like handing a lit torch to someone standing in a room full of gunpowder. Realizing his mistake, Velázquez tried to revoke the commission, but Cortez was already halfway to the ships, flanked by soldiers, priests, lawyers, horses, and just enough artillery to start a small international crisis. This was strategic insubordination at its finest. Cortez didn't just ignore orders. He built an entire expedition designed to look official enough to pass inspection, but chaotic enough to function like a conquest. He wasn't just preparing for exploration, he was preparing for invasion, but with paperwork. Among the more ridiculous details, he brought notaries to document everything. Every alliance, every skirmish, every peaceful seizure of territory was recorded by someone in a hat holding a quill. It was part legal defense, part performance art. If questioned, he could point to the papers and say, "See? It's all extremely legitimate. Also ignore the canons." He also brought priests, because nothing says holy mission like aggressively spreading Christianity at sword point. The idea was to convert the native population, baptize them en masse, and then, because they were now Christian, claim that Spain had a moral obligation to rule them. It was a classic conquest by salvation maneuver, and Cortez wielded it with the enthusiasm of someone who had memorized the loopholes. Oh, and of course the cannons, because nothing calms international tensions like loading 20 steel barrels of diplomatic encouragement onto your ships. In total, Cortez launched with 11 ships, over 500 men, 16 horses, several translators, and exactly zero approval from anyone in charge. He had no official support from the Spanish crown. Velázquez was actively trying to stop him. His orders were technically cancelled, but Cortez had a weapon more powerful than legality: momentum. Once those sails caught wind, no bureaucrat was going to outpace him. And then there's the infamous burning the boats moment. Legend says that upon landing on the Mexican coast, Cortez immediately ordered all his ships destroyed, usually dramatized as a symbolic act of commitment. No retreat, no surrender, no refunds. Historians today argue it wasn't quite that cinematic. He probably scuttled, i.e. disabled the ships rather than turning them into a bonfire party. Still, the effect was the same. His men could no longer leave. They either succeeded or became a historical footnote. Either way, the message was clear. Cortez didn't just burn his ships, he burned his exit strategy. There would be no going back to Cuba, no graceful exit, no last-minute retreat. Whether his men liked it or not, and they had very mixed feelings about this, they were now committed to a mission that involved marching into unknown territory, facing unknown people, and probably violating unknown numbers of international laws. To keep morale high, or at least confused, Cortez held formal readings of his justifications. He claimed he wasn't defying Velázquez, he was acting in the name of the king, because if you say royal service with enough conviction, it sounds noble instead of treasonous. This sleight-of-hand politics worked surprisingly well. His men stayed. Most even backed him when it became clear this wasn't a scouting trip. It was the opening act of imperial theatre, and they were cast as both lead actors and future landowners. Thus began one of the most consequential unauthorized field trips in world history. Cortez had no real command, no royal sanction, and no plan B. What he had was charisma, cannons, and just enough self-delusion to carry an army into the unknown. And Mexico had no idea what was coming. If history is shaped by misunderstandings, then the early encounters between Hernan Cortez and the peoples of Mesoamerica were less first contact, and more long, confusing game of telephone played with swords. By the time Cortez began marching inland from the Veracruz coast, he was encountering a world far older, more complex, and significantly better organized than anything the Spanish had imagined. The problem? Neither side really understood what the other wanted, and both assumed it was bad news. Cortez's first major encounter was with the Totonacs, a coastal people under the thumb of the powerful Mexica Aztecs. They didn't exactly love being part of the Aztec tribute system. Think high taxes, forced military service, and the occasional human sacrifice you didn't volunteer for. So when the Spaniards arrived with horses, guns, beards, and confusing religious pamphlets, the Totonacs looked at Cortez and saw opportunity. specifically the kind of opportunity that came with cannons and plausible deniability. The Totonacs offered food, shelter, and crucially, intel. Cortez, to his credit, knew how to weaponize local resentment. He wasn't just conquering with Spanish soldiers, he was building a patchwork alliance of people who hated the Aztecs slightly more than they feared European steel. It was the Mesoamerican version of the enemy of my enemy is a surprisingly aggressive man in armor. Next came the Tlaxcalans, fierce warriors who had spent decades being a thorn in the Aztec side. Initially, they treated Cortez and his band like hostile invaders, which, to be fair, they were. A series of battles ensued. But when the Spaniards didn't die as expected, and instead inflicted shocking damage thanks to their armor, horses, and portable cannons, the Tlaxcalans paused, took a long look at their bloody fields, and thought, maybe we negotiate instead. This pivot proved crucial. The Tlaxcalan alliance gave Cortez thousands of indigenous warriors who not only knew the terrain but also had centuries of reasons to want the Aztecs toppled. Cortez wasn't invading alone anymore. He was now leading a multicultural revenge tour. But none of this would have worked without one particular woman, Malinche, also known as Doña Marina, a native woman given or sold to the Spaniards as a slave early in their campaign. She quickly proved indispensable. She could speak both Nahuatl, the language of the Mexica, and Mayan dialects, and with the help of a Spanish priest who spoke Mayan, they created a relay translation system, indigenous Mayan Spanish. It was the Google Translate of doom, and Malinche was the processor holding it all together. But Malinche wasn't just a translator. She became Cortez's advisor, strategist, and eventually mother to his child. Her knowledge of the political landscape helped him form alliances, exploit rivalries, and understand just enough of local diplomacy to fake being diplomatic. Without her, Cortez would have likely walked into Tenochtitlan like a lost tourist asking for directions to the nearest pyramid. And speaking of Tenochtitlan, at the heart of the Mexica Empire, it's here we arrive at one of the most enduring and misleading myths in colonial history, that Moctezuma II, the Aztec emperor, believed Cortez was the return of the god Quetzalcoatl. Let's be clear, the evidence for this is about as solid as a soggy tortilla. The main sources for the god confusion story come from Spanish chroniclers, men with a vested interest in framing their conquest as a divine misunderstanding, rather than a calculated invasion. The idea that the Aztec emperor handed over his empire because he was starstruck by Cortez's beard and shiny armor. Convenient. Too convenient. What's more likely is that Moctezuma was playing his own game of diplomacy. Faced with strange foreigners backed by growing indigenous coalitions, he probably opted for a cautious, strategic welcome offering gifts, not because he thought Cortez was a deity, but because he wanted to buy time and possibly keep the chaos outside the city walls. In Mesoamerican culture, gift-giving wasn't just generosity, it was political theater. Unfortunately for the Mexica, the Spanish interpreted "here are some gold objects, please leave," as congratulations, you now own the place. Cortez naturally took the lavish offerings, gold, feathers, ceremonial items as proof that the Aztecs wanted Spanish rule. His men, suddenly surrounded by treasure, started looking at the empire like it was a walk-in treasure chest with housing options. The cultural disconnect was staggering. The Mexica viewed the world through a lens of ritual, cosmic balance, and empire building via tribute. The Spanish viewed it through Catholic imperialism, personal greed, and the unwavering belief that they were always the heroes of their own story. Which leads us to the ultimate summary of this awkward historical encounter. He showed up with horses, steel, and smallpox. Moctezuma probably thought he was a very rude storm god, because while Moctezuma may not have thought Cortez was divine, there was no question that the arrival of the Spaniards brought death, confusion, and the early tremors of disaster, and things were about to go from lost in translation to completely off the rails. By late 1519, Hernan Cortez and his mismatched traveling circus of Spaniards, Tlaxcalans, Totonacs, and one very overworked translator had finally reached the doorstep of Tenochtitlan. the shimmering capital of the Mexica Aztec Empire, perched like a mirage in the middle of Lake Texcoco. They had marched hundreds of miles, endured ambushes, tropical illnesses, betrayal, and several meals that may have been armadillo, but nothing could prepare them for the jaw-dropping architectural flex that was Tenochtitlan. Forget mud huts and jungle paths. This was a floating metropolis, with stone causeways, towering temples, bustling marketplaces, and an estimated population of over 200,000 people. For perspective, that was more than Madrid, Seville, or Venice at the time. The Spanish expected backwater. What they got was urban planning that made Europe look like it still hadn't figured out plumbing. Corte, to his credit, kept his cool. Internally, however, he was probably going through several stages of cultural panic. One Spanish chronicler described the approach across the causeway as a moment of near religious awe. Think lakeside skyline meets imperial spectacle meets, we might have underestimated these people. Moctezuma II, Emperor of the Mexica, was waiting. He didn't arrive with an army or a death squad, as might be expected when an armed band of foreigners is casually marching into your capital. No, he arrived with flowers, necklaces, and the kind of anxious diplomacy that screams, "I'd like this not to end in fire, please." The meeting between Cortez and Moctezuma is one of the most awkward moments in history. Two powerful men, neither speaking the other's language, both aware they were stepping into an irreversible moment. Malinche translated. Gifts were exchanged, and everyone smiled, the kind of tight, diplomatic smile people use when no one's sure if they're being honored or threatened. Moctezuma welcomed Cortez as an honored guest. He gave him luxurious quarters, rare foods, and enough gold trinkets to make a dragon blush. The Spanish interpreted this as subservience. The Mexica likely saw it as ritual hospitality, a temporary peace offering while the emperor figured out how to deal with these increasingly unsettling visitors. Tenochtitlan was a marvel of engineering and organization. There were clean streets, floating gardens, aqueducts, and even public restrooms, a revolutionary concept for Europeans still fond of tossing chamber pots out of windows. The marketplace at Tlaxcala was larger than anything Cortez had ever seen, a swirling mass of trade and commerce that made Castilian towns look like weekend flea markets. Still, tensions buzzed beneath the surface. The Mexican nobility watched the Spanish with barely concealed suspicion. The people of the city murmured about the strange, pale-faced visitors who wore metal skins and didn't bathe nearly enough. And Cortez? He was increasingly aware that while he was surrounded by wealth beyond imagining, he was also hopelessly outnumbered. And yet, he couldn't stop himself from plotting. The longer he stayed, the more obsessed he became with the idea of conquest. This wasn't just a city, it was an empire's heart, and Cortez wanted to rip it out and plant a Spanish flag in the crater. The gold alone was intoxicating. He recorded in his letters that the city sparkled with it. Altars, jewelry, decorations, even utensils. The only thing the city didn't have, apparently, was a "Please don't steal me" sign posted above every golden object. It was like showing up to a dinner party and realizing your host owns more gold than your king. This wasn't an exaggeration. Cortez sent Moctezuma's gifts, gilded shields, feathered fans, and intricate masks back to Spain as evidence of the wealth they'd stumbled upon. He made sure the king knew what was at stake. It was both a brag and a bargaining chip. Look at what I've found. Now imagine what I could take if you let me keep going. But taking the city wasn't as easy as admiring it. Moctezuma wasn't an idiot. He walked a political tightrope, balancing hospitality with surveillance. The Spaniards were well-fed, well-housed, and very much not free to wander. Every gesture of goodwill came with subtle pressure. Cortez was being treated as a temporary guest, not a conqueror. And yet, both men knew that this polite dance was unsustainable. Cortez couldn't leave without gold, glory, and proof of divine right. Moctezuma couldn't let a foreign army camp in his palace forever. The whole situation was one giant diplomatic hostage situation, except no one had decided who the hostage was yet. Even the Spanish soldiers sensed the discomfort. Some whispered about mutiny. Others marveled at the city, unsure whether they'd stepped into heaven, hell, or something in between. The tension was thick enough to cut with an obsidian blade, and so they sat. Spaniards feasting awkwardly, Aztec nobles side-eyeing them across the ceremonial halls, and two leaders pretending they weren't each planning their next move. It was only a matter of time before someone broke the silence. At some point during Hernan Cortez's extended stay in Tenochtitlan, he must have looked around at the glittering palaces, thousands of suspicious stairs and endless gold-covered altars, and thought, "This is going great. Let's escalate." And escalate he did, by doing what any truly bold conquistador with an inflated sense of destiny and a loose grasp on international etiquette might do. He kidnapped the emperor. Yes, Moctezuma II, ruler of the Mexica Empire, god-king of a vast civilization, was taken hostage in his own palace, not by an overwhelming army, but by a few dozen Spaniards and a whole lot of audacity, and the wildest part, they pulled it off without a full-blown war breaking out. At least not immediately. Let's back up slightly. Following a suspicious explosion in political tension sparked when the Spanish learned that one of their smaller garrisons on the coast had been attacked, a minor incident involving some conquistador egos and poor diplomacy, Cortez decided it was no longer safe for Moctezuma to remain in charge. Or, as he probably phrased it to Moctezuma, "We're not detaining you, we're just protecting you with swords. In your own home." This was diplomatic hostage-taking, 16th century style, and Cortez managed to sell it with a straight face. He told Moctezuma that there was no coup, no arrest, just a need for mutual cooperation under the close supervision of people in armor who were absolutely not guests anymore. Cortez mastered the art of diplomacy. Smile, nod, and casually detain your host at sword point. Amazingly, Moctezuma agreed, at least outwardly. Perhaps he saw it as a temporary gesture to preserve peace. Perhaps he hoped to manipulate the Spaniards from within. Or maybe he realized that refusing could spark chaos his city wasn't ready for. Whatever the reason, he walked under his own power into a new palace, now a gilded cage controlled by the Spanish. From that moment on, the dynamic in Tenochtitlan turned ice cold. Cortez began ruling through Moctezuma. The emperor remained a public figurehead, appearing before crowds, issuing decrees, and smiling the hollow smile of a man reading cue cards under duress. But behind the scenes, it was the Spanish calling the shots, deciding tax policy, managing gold tribute, and quietly dismantling the illusion of Aztec control, one polite demand at a time. For the Mexica people, this was baffling. Their ruler, a divine figure descended from gods, was still visible but clearly not free. Whispers spread, tensions rose. The city grew restless. Nobles began to doubt, and the population, already suspicious of the foreigners with their strange gods, steel weapons, and suspicious interest in every golden object, started to simmer. And then, just as everything was on the brink of combusting, Cortez received news that someone else had arrived to ruin the party. Panfilo de Narvaez, a fellow Spaniard sent by none other than Diego Velázquez, yes, that Diego Velázquez, to arrest Cortez and shut down his rogue expedition. To summarize, Cortez was illegally occupying a foreign capital, holding its emperor hostage, and now had to leave his position of fragile dominance to go fight other Spaniards who were mad at him for breaking rules that he'd already torn up months ago. Naturally, he left Pedro de Alvarado in charge. Alvarado, a man known for his military prowess and complete lack of impulse control, was about as subtle as a cannon in a library. Cortez must have known this wasn't ideal, but Cortez also had a pattern. Leap first, solve consequences mid-air. He marched out of Tenochtitlan with a force of about 250 men, and left behind a garrison in a city now bristling with resentment, led by a man who considered subtle diplomacy a form of weakness. He was gone for weeks. Meanwhile, tensions boiled. The people of Tenochtitlan were watching their emperor walk and talk like a puppet. Sacred rituals were interrupted. Spanish demands increased. Rumors swirled that Moctezuma had lost the favor of the gods, or worse, had betrayed his people. In a culture where cosmology and leadership were intertwined, This wasn't just political unrest, it was spiritual upheaval. And Moctezuma? He remained composed, issuing orders, attending ceremonies, and pretending not to notice the sword permanently hovering near his back. Whether he still hoped for a peaceful resolution or simply knew resistance meant blood, he remained outwardly compliant while the city edged toward implosion. All the while, Cortez marched out to face Narvaez, beat him in battle, convinced his soldiers to join him, and returned to Tenochtitlan with more men than he had left with. Somehow, his unauthorized conquest had just absorbed the very army sent to stop it, but during his absence, something had cracked in Tenochtitlan, and it wasn't going to be fixed with smiles and forced greetings. Let's be clear, if Hernan Cortez thought holding Moctezuma hostage would keep things under control, he was about to get a full-on, high-speed, gold-encrusted wake-up call. Because after weeks of pressure, a gruesome massacre, and one very angry city, the people of Tenochtitlan finally decided they'd had enough of divine diplomacy and steel-plated guests. Welcome to La Noche Triste, the Night of Sorrows, named either for the tears of the defeated or the poetic drama of Spanish chroniclers. Either way, it involved screaming, chaos, and more drowning conquistadors than anyone had on their 1520 bingo card. When Cortés returned to Tenochtitlan after defeating Narvaez and poaching his army, he found the city completely unrecognizable, not physically but emotionally. The streets were tense, the marketplaces were empty, the air felt thick with the unspoken words, "Get out." Why? Because in his absence, his second-in-command, Pedro de Alvarado, had decided diplomacy was for the weak and slaughtered nobles, priests and dancers during a major religious festival. Imagine hosting a peaceful ceremony in honor of your gods, flowers, incense, music, only for your guests to suddenly turn into a knife fight with brass trumpets. It wasn't just a massacre, it was a sacrilege. The people of Tenochtitlan didn't just mourn the dead, they were spiritually shaken, enraged, and now had a very clear understanding of Spanish hospitality. Smile, accept the gift, then stab you mid-ceremony. When Cortés arrived back, the Mexica weren't interested in apologies or more forced alliances. They rioted, barricades went up, supplies were cut off, stones and spears rained down on the Spanish compound. The Mexica warriors, experts in urban warfare, sealed the causeways and prepared to bleed the invaders dry. Cortés's dream of conquest was now a slow-motion siege in paradise. In a move so bizarre it feels like historical improv, Cortés brought Moctezuma, still his hostage-turned-roommate, up to the roof of the palace and had him ask the angry crowd to stand down. It went about as well as you'd expect. Some sources say Moctezuma pleaded, others say he tried to negotiate. Whatever he said, the crowd responded by throwing rocks at him. Whether out of rage, heartbreak, or sheer disbelief, they struck the emperor in the head. A few days later, Moctezuma died. The cause of death remains murky. Spanish accounts claim he died of his wounds. Indigenous sources allege the Spanish killed him when it became clear he was no longer useful. Either way, the divine ruler of the Mexica Empire exited history in one of the most tragic, confusing, and depressingly symbolic ways imaginable, struck down in a moment of betrayal, surrounded by foreign steel. With Moctezuma gone, the Mexica had no reason to tolerate a single foreign soldier in their city. The only thing left for Cortés and his men to do now was flee. On the night of June 30, 1520, Cortés and his men tried to sneak out of Tenochtitlan under the cover of darkness. The plan was to slip across the causeways, narrow bridges over the lake's canals, and quietly disappear into the night like guilt-ridden houseguests sneaking away after breaking the fine china. But there was one problem. They brought the gold. Lots of it. Too much. So much that Spanish soldiers stuffed their armor, bags, and even their boots with gold artifacts looted from temples and homes. They jingled when they walked. They sparkled when they turned corners. They were less like a stealth operation and more like a mobile jewelry store trying to commit a heist against itself. And then came the ambush. The Mexica were waiting. As the Spanish column stretched across the narrow causeways, warriors in canoes, and from rooftops launched a coordinated attack. Arrows, spears, and sling stones rained down. Warriors cut off retreat. The lake turned into a killing field. Spanish soldiers, weighed down by greed, literally fell into the canals and drowned. Horses panicked and bucked into the water. Allies were cut off, trampled, or abandoned. Many of the Tlaxcalan warriors who had fought beside Cortez were slaughtered during the retreat. It turns out gold makes a poor life jacket. By the time morning light hit the blood-stained waters, hundreds were dead. Cortez survived, barely, along with a battered fragment of his original force. He wept under a tree, or so legend claims, giving the night its melancholy name. The Mexica had reclaimed their capital. The Spanish were on the run, and the conquest, for a brief shining moment, looked completely and utterly defeated. But Cortez wasn't done yet, because if there was one thing more dangerous than a conquistador high on gold and ego, it was a humiliated one who still had backup. After La Noche Triste, Hernan Cortez wasn't just wounded. He was humiliated, hollow-eyed, and more determined than ever to finish what he'd started, even if it meant burning half of Mexico to do it. So what do you do when you've just lost your men, your gold, and the goodwill of an entire empire? If you're Cortez, you take a deep breath, cry under a tree, and then start building boats in the mountains. Yes, boats in the mountains, but we'll get to that. First, Cortez had to regroup. After his escape from Tenochtitlan, he limped back to Tlaxcala, the same fierce city-state that had once fought him, then joined him, then looked on in horror as his conquest went sideways. Amazingly, the Tlaxcalans agreed to help him again, partly out of long-standing hatred for the Mexica, and partly because Cortez was still a useful if volatile sledgehammer aimed at their enemies. Cortez didn't waste the second chance. He sent messengers across the region, rekindled alliances, and absorbed every scrap of manpower he could muster. Indigenous forces, once hesitant about the Spanish, now saw a wounded animal backed into a corner, and many joined, hoping to either help finish the Aztecs or just be on the winning side when the dust settled. Meanwhile, back in Tenochtitlan, something worse than swords was spreading. Smallpox, likely introduced by a single infected Spanish slave or soldier. The disease ripped through the Mexica population like fire in dry brush. The people had no immunity. The result was apocalyptic. In a matter of months, up to half the population of Tenochtitlan was dead or dying, including children, warriors, priests, and even the newly crowned Emperor Cuitlahuac, Moctezuma's brother. The timing was either miraculous or monstrous, depending on your perspective. Cortez didn't plan it. He couldn't have, but he absolutely benefited from it. He couldn't have planned it better if he tried, which is horrifying because he didn't try. With the empire spiritually and physically crushed, Cortez began Phase 2, the siege of Tenochtitlan. And yes, about those boats. Lake Texcoco surrounded the island city, and Cortez knew from experience that attacking by land alone was a death wish. So in one of the most wildly ambitious logistics moves in conquest history, he built a fleet of small ships inland, disassembled them, and carried them piece by piece over mountains, through forests, and across ravines until they could be reassembled and launched on the lake. This wasn't just overkill, it was personal. By mid-1521, the siege was on. Spanish forces blocked the causeways, canoes were destroyed, food supplies were cut off. Day by day, the most advanced city in the Americas was choked from the outside in. The canals, once the lifeblood of urban trade and irrigation, became trenches filled with corpses. Disease festered. Hunger ravaged even the nobility. Still, the Mexica didn't give up easily. Cuauhtémoc, the final emperor, emerged as a powerful and tragic figure, young, charismatic, and determined. He refused surrender, leading defense efforts with brutal bravery. But bravery alone couldn't stop the slow grinding machinery of starvation, disease, and artillery. Yes, artillery. By this point, Cortez had cannons, crossbows, and siege tactics straight out of medieval Europe applied to a city built on a lake. It was a strategy forged in desperation and funded by sheer vengeance. The siege dragged on for nearly 3 months, and by the end, Tenochtitlan, once the shimmering jewel of the Mexico world, was reduced to a smoking, corpse-littered ruin. The temples were razed, the canals clogged, survivors were enslaved, executed, or forced to watch the only world they'd ever known dissolve into rubble. On August 13, 1521, Cuauhtémoc was captured while trying to flee in a canoe. Brought before Cortez, he reportedly asked to be killed on the spot. Cortez, ever the dramatic conqueror, spared him, but not out of mercy. He needed a trophy, not a martyr. And just like that, the Aztec Empire was no more. In its place, Cortez began building Mexico City, a colonial capital atop the bones of a civilization that had stood for centuries. The irony: the streets of this new Spanish city would be paved using the stones of the temples they destroyed, a literal rebuilding of history in their own image. The conquest of Tenochtitlan wasn't just the fall of a city, it was the opening act of 300 years of colonial rule, marked by exploitation, evangelism, and enough blood to make the gold seem cheap by comparison. Cortez, now flush with victory, gold, and horrific stories to tell, the Spanish crown had conquered one of the greatest empires in the Western Hemisphere. But in doing so, he had unleashed forces no one could truly control: epidemics, rebellions, and the slow grind of cultural erasure. And yet, in his own mind, he had won. He had burned the boats, gambled everything, and walked away with an empire. The ground was soaked, the city was gone, but Hernan Cortez, he was just getting started. You'd think that conquering a mighty empire, claiming vast lands, looting a fortune in gold, and having the Pope nod in your general direction would be enough for one lifetime. But for Hernan Cortez, history's most ambitious overachiever with a sword and superiority complex, it wasn't enough, not even close. Because after the dust settled on the smoldering ruins of Tenochtitlan, Cortez expected a hero's welcome. Parades, promotions, maybe even a golden chariot carried by grateful nobles. What he got instead was paperwork, and a lot of it. Cortez had acted without royal permission when he launched his conquest of Mexico. Technically, he was supposed to be exploring, not raising ancient civilizations and appointing himself lord of everything west of Spain. So while King Charles V couldn't ignore the mountains of gold pouring into Spanish coffers, he also couldn't just let some swaggering upstart in armor go around playing emperor. So the crown gave him a reward, with conditions. He was made Marquis of the Valley of Oaxaca, given land, some titles, and ceremonial credit. But they also stripped him of actual governing power in New Spain. In fact, Cortez's enemies back in the Spanish court, who had been quietly collecting grudges like stamps, made sure his leash was shorter than ever. Cortez wanted to rule an empire. Spain gave him a fancy title and a polite, "Thank you, please stop now." Naturally, he didn't take it well. Cortez spent the next few years trying to govern New Spain anyway, clashing with appointed officials, writing scathing letters to the crown, and attempting to micromanage a colony from the chaos of post-conquest ruins. His leadership style, best described as "I'm in charge because I said so," didn't mesh well with imperial accountants. At one point, he even launched a side expedition to Honduras, hoping to prove his relevance and maybe find another civilization to accidentally conquer. The journey was grueling, yielded no great riches, and nearly destroyed what was left of his reputation. When he returned to Mexico City, it wasn't to applause, it was to investigations, accusations of corruption, and more people saying, "Wait, why are you still here?" So Cortez did what any egotistical, sidelined warlord would do. He went back to Spain to clear his name and file lawsuits. Back in Spain, Cortez became that guy who shows up at every party uninvited, loudly reciting his resume. He petitioned the court. He tried to meet with the king. He sued officials, other conquistadors, and the Spanish colonial administration for denying him his due. It was less hero's homecoming and more awkward uncle crashing the reunion. Royal officials were polite but cold. Cortez, once the golden boy of global conquest, had become a political liability. He was seen as difficult, arrogant, and dangerously independent. Kings liked loyalty. Cortez liked reminding people how many temples he burned to get their gold. He conquered an empire, annoyed his own king, and died trying to sue everyone who wronged him. A full-circle villain arc. To make matters worse, he never really got an audience with King Charles V, at least not one that changed his fortunes. He spent his final years roaming between his estate and the royal court, writing letters filled with righteous indignation and weirdly poetic despair. His health declined, his influence vanished. By the end, Cortez was a walking reminder of how fame curdles when you outlive your usefulness. He died in 1547, relatively wealthy, but largely ignored. Spain didn't throw a parade, New Spain didn't build a statue. The empire he'd conquered moved on without him. Today, Hernan Cortez is remembered as a conqueror, colonizer, and cultural bulldozer. In some European histories, he's painted as a daring explorer. In others, as a cautionary tale of unchecked ambition. In Mexico, he's remembered as the man who toppled an empire and opened the floodgates of colonial devastation. And it's not just about what he did, it's how he did it. He didn't stumble into victory. He manipulated, strategized, and gambled with lives and empires like it was a card game he knew he'd win. Even his successes were stitched with cruelty, deception, and monumental ego. He left behind a mixed bag of legacies: Spanish dominance in the Americas, widespread indigenous suffering, and a historical reputation so toxic it still sparks protests centuries later. But here's the kicker. For all his victories, Cortez never got what he really wanted: control. Not of Mexico, not of his legacy, not even of his posthumous reputation. He came, he saw, he conquered, and then he litigated. And maybe that's the perfect ending for someone like Hernan Cortez. Not dying in glorious battle, but quietly frustrated, forgotten, and buried beneath the very system he helped build.